From 2013 to 2019, I worked in outdoor education in many different summer camps and outdoor education centers in Canada, mostly Ontario, but I did spend a season or two in the Rocky Mountains. Having grown up, going to sleepaway camp, and eventually participating in month-long leadership programs with backcountry canoeing components, I was well prepared to lead a group of teen girls from a camp in Georgian Bay on a 2-week camping trip in the Temagami region during my first year as a counselor. The Temagami region is located between North Bay, Sudbury, and Timmins, Ontario. This region is home to many provincial parks, wonderful hiking and canoeing routes, and the Bear Island Indian Reserve. Our route was typical and beginning the Whitefish Falls region, ending at Highway 11 after 14 days of paddling, portaging, hiking, and campfire making. We had a satellite phone to check in with our camp director every day, and in case of an emergency. We also had multiple exit points along the route. Until our second to last night, we were having fun in a relatively uneventful time. Besides some mild dehydration and the usual bumps and bruises, everything was great. Near the end of our trip, we were doing some free camping on the shore of an uninhabited island in Bear Lake that is recognized as part of the Bear Island Indian Reserve. It is a beautiful area, and we were across from the main island that had about 250 people in its population. We had put out the fire and gone to bed when about an hour after falling asleep, I was jarred awake by the sound of a loud motorboat. Obviously, this is not that weird because it's a large lake, and many people use boats to reach the mainland or their homes on secluded islands. However, it was around 11 p.m., and things had been quiet for at least a few hours. The motor would cut out, and I could clearly hear an argument. It sounded like at least one man and a woman were incredibly angry and yelling at each other, although I could not hear anything specific because they were too far offshore. Suddenly, the woman screamed and I heard a splash into the water, and then complete silence. At this point, I was pretty freaked out and hoping to God that my girls had not waken up. But I was not that lucky because I could immediately hear talking from their tent and could tell they were scared. I was about to unzip my door and look out to see if maybe the boaters had an accident or something when my whole tent lit up. The light slowly panned across me and onto the tent of my girls. This immediately made them quiet. In a normal volume, I was able to tell them to stay still. The light panned back to my tent and then over to theirs again. I can only guess that it must have been some sort of boat with a spotlight on it. If anyone has any ideas of what type of boat that may be, let me know in the comments. After an eternity, that was only about 5 minutes. The light was turned off, and I heard the motor engage and fade as the boat drove away from us. I immediately found the satellite phone and called our camp director, who gave us the number for the local police. I called them, and they said they would forward the information I gave them to the local native detachment on Bear Island. I do not think any of us slept that night, and I got up at 5 a.m. to take my canoe out and look around. I thought maybe someone had fallen overboard and had managed to swim to shore. Obviously, I did not find anyone, and there was nothing floating in the water either, although it is a deep body of water. None of us wanted to camp one more night, so I called the camp and had them head out to the picking up point a day early. We paddled like hell and did not really think or talk too much. I think none of us really wanted to speculate about what we might have heard and what would have happened if we had made noise or moved when the light was on our tents. I have thought about this a lot over the years, but whenever I've told people the story, they've been quite skeptical. I recently started looking into missing person cases in the area, but without much luck. If anyone hearing this is familiar with Indigenous issues in Canada though, there is an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, and these cases usually go unreported and unsolved. This happened 2 years ago, and since the anniversary just passed, I thought I would finally share the story. My fiancé and I were on the second night of our 2-night camping trip at a popular campground about a half hour from where we live. For reference, My fiance is black. We live in a predominantly white, conservative, and unfortunately racist area. This is important later. On our first night, we kept hearing noises in the woods around us. The campsite right beside ours to the right was occupied, but the one to the left was not. The campsites are about 150 yards apart, and we had camped here in the same exact plot the year before. We were familiar with the area and the various kinds of animals that live in these woods. The first night, we heard shuffling around our tent. It was obviously something large moving around. We brushed it off and assumed it was just a deer or something. Now back to the main event. On August 11th, we spent the day at the battlefields a town over with my family. They had all been invited to join us for a day by my fiancé as a surprise for me while he proposed to me. We stayed with my family in the evening, about 6 p.m. before heading back to our campsite. When we got back, things were odd. Someone had obviously been in our tent. Our blankets were thrown around, clothes were on the floor, and my backpack had been rearranged. I was missing underwear, but hey, we were stupid 19-year-olds and decided that since whoever had, busted in our tent had been gone and had not taken anything important, that it must be okay, and that they would probably not come back. So we set up a campfire and sat out until it was dark, roasting hot dogs and s'mores, smoking cigarettes and celebrating our engagement. Around 9:30 p.m. we put our fire out and decided to go into our tent and try to celebrate a little bit more. Nothing too loud or obnoxious. Immediately after we finished, we started to hear the noises outside of our tent again. But this time we focused on. We heard clear footsteps, and at one point, a man whispering. We looked at each other and our eyes got wide. Someone was walking around outside our tent. We were still and completely silent, just listening to the footsteps, and we heard whispering again. Oh no, make that 2 men walking around our tent. As if we had the ability to read minds, my fiancé said, "I have to go to the bathroom," and I agreed. The bathroom was up the hill from our site. Most people who were in lower sites like ours drove their cars up to the bathroom. Now, here's the part I still get chills thinking about. We got up and were getting dressed. My fiancé had just turned on the light in our tent and put his binder on when a man spoke directly to us right outside our tent.
"What are you doing?"
I cannot even describe how malicious and menacing this voice sounded. It was clearly directed at us, and he said it with a snicker. He was watching us through the walls of the tent. Again, for this part, we were stupid 19-year-olds, so we just decided to run it for the car. My fiancé grabbed his pocket knife and his keys and stepped out of the tent. He pulled me with him, and we ran like hell to the car. I heard the footsteps running behind us, then turning and running up to another campsite. At the bathroom, we talked over our options. We talked about sleeping in a car or driving into the town. Then we had another idea. We drove back down to our campsite and began packing everything into the car. At this part, it was around midnight. We moved faster than I think was even possible, wrapping up the tent with our belongings still in it and grabbing our folding chairs. We were all packed in 5 minutes and hopped into the car to leave. I jumped out at the end of the drive and grabbed our nameplate, which had my full name on it, off the post. As we pulled out of the campsite, I saw our assailants for the first time, stalking through the woods onto our campsite. They were 2 tall white men. I realized that these were the same men who had been driving past our campsite the whole time we were there, just glaring at us and muttering to each other. One was wearing camo hunting gear, and the other was wearing a Confederate flag tank top. Both were carrying large hunting knives, unsheathed and at the ready. They turned when they saw our car driving by. One started to make chase until the other stopped him. I made eye contact with the man in camo, and he smiled the most terrifyingly evil smile at me and shook his head slowly. We drove the long way home, taking all the weirdest, hardest to follow roads, and called my dad so he would know we were coming. When we got home, we told my dad everything, and he shrugged it off as us being paranoid, so I never told anyone else besides all of you now. I'm convinced to this day that this was going to be a racially motivated attack. The campground was not heavily populated, and my fiancé was the only non-white person at any of these campsites. It was no accident that the 2 men who had been shadowing us since our arrival and wore Confederate flags and had one on their truck decided to target the interracial couple. I still get cold chills when I think about how close we were to being killed or seriously hurt that night, and just how lucky we were that our reckless plan to make a run for it actually worked. This is a completely true story. I am just interested to know if anyone knows what it could have been. There was one time, about 2 or 3 years ago, I was out in the woods camping with my brother, and we had just gotten there at around 4 p.m. to set everything up. Once we had everything set up, we got a fire going. And then, once we got the fire going, I told my brother I was going to go get some firewood because we only had enough just to start the fire. So I went out, and it was probably around 7 p.m. And then, suddenly, it got cold even though the weather was not cold at all. I got a sudden rush of coldness. I felt a heavy feeling of just pure evil and hatred, even despair. I immediately went back to my brother. He told me that it was fine and there was probably just a strong thing of wind coming through. But I knew something was wrong. We sat around the fire, and I just felt like someone or something was staring at me. Once again, I started to feel the same feeling of that evil, and it was not faint this time. It was slowly getting worse and worse, as if it were just growing inside of me. I brushed it off and went to bed. At around 2:20 a.m.-ish in the morning, I heard something that sounded like a scream, and it woke me up. I looked around in the tent and got a flashlight. When I turned the light on, I noticed that my arm was bleeding and had been cut open by something in multiple spots. I woke my brother up in a panic and told him what happened. He said he did not know, but he thinks that I probably just cut it before we got in the tent or something. There's a lot of thorns out there. Even though I was looking right at it, it was obviously a fresh cut and it was bleeding. I said, "Are you joking?" And he continued to say that nothing happened to me and I was pranking him. At around that time, I felt a huge amount of pain in my arm, and then I heard that scream again. But it did not sound like how humans scream. It was more of a screech, like that of an animal or some creature in the distance. It sounded like it was in pain. I looked at my brother and asked if he heard that, and he said, "What do you mean do I hear that? Nothing happened." At that point, I was scared for my life. I was praying that nothing would happen. Then, after just a few more minutes, I heard that scream again. Every time this thing screamed, I would feel the pain in my arm, and it would just get worse and worse. I would start to have a burning feeling. Eventually, all of it just stopped though. Although after that, I was not able to sleep for the rest of the night. I mean, come on, who would be? The next morning, I told my brother we have to leave ASAP. When we went to the truck, I could have sworn, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something run through the woods. We got to the truck and I looked out while packing the stuff up, and 4 of the trees had marks like they had been clawed by something. But the thing is that the marks were at least 12 feet up in the tree, maybe even higher. At that point, I was so tired and scared I just got in the truck and we left. To this day, I still have not ever gone camping again, and I still wonder what it was. Does anybody have any ideas of what it was? Why couldn't my brother hear or see what was happening? So, when I was growing up, I would spend some of my spring breaks at a cabin in North Van, near Capilino. We called the cabin Camp Capilino, and I would go to the local community center. I believe the cabin we went to was in the 1992 movie To Grandmother's House We Go. It was the house the grandmother lived in. Anyway, I stayed at this cabin multiple times with this group of other kids and our leaders. We had always all slept together in the side of the cabin that had a boys' sign on the door. Never really thought anything of it, but the last year I went to that camp, we stayed on the girls' side. I had thought the cabin had felt sad and strange to begin with, but for some reason sleeping on the side we left empty the previous year, this gave me anxiety. Eventually, It became time for everyone to go to sleep, and I got picked to be in the top bunk. I was happy about it, until about 3 a.m. when I woke up and the room was ice cold. I had a rather slippery, old rubber-coated mattress, and my sleeping bag had decided to slide almost all the way off. I sat up to get back inside, and as I sat all the way up, I saw a completely white little girl that looked nothing like the other kids I was with. She was standing over one of the leaders sleeping on the floor, just staring at her. At this time, I had realized that I was looking at a spirit of some kind. I quickly pulled my sleeping bag up and over my head as I lay back down. I knew what I saw was not just a dream, and it was indeed real. I did the cliché and pinched myself several times to make sure of it. Some time had passed and I was finally warm again. Fully closed inside my sleeping bag, I decided it was time to check the room for the girl. She was gone, and so was the cold. I did not sleep too well after. The next day I had mentioned this to my friends. The leaders quickly caught wind of this and did everything to try and tell me it was just a dream. I knew this was so the other kids would not be scared, but they were scared regardless. It was just before lunch and that meant pool time. The creepy old cabin had a heated outdoor pool right beside it, and the groundskeeper and owner was the lifeguard. Being the curious kid I am, I floated over to the side he was sitting on and began asking him about anyone seeing ghosts on the property. He did not hold back telling me that his daughter had seen a ghost a few times in the cabin and on the trails behind it. I asked him if it was an all-white little girl with long straight hair, and he gave me a weird look and proceeded to say, "How did you know that? That's exactly what my daughter said." I told him about my experience and he acted if it was almost good luck that I saw the girl. I honestly thought it was incredible, but our leaders quickly shut down the conversation after hearing us. I understand there were other kids there, but I had to solve that mystery. Maybe it was because of watching too much Scooby-Doo or paranormal-based shows as a kid. The same day, the leader sat us down and tried to tell everyone that I just had a dream, and not to listen to me or the owner of the cabin. I was obviously hurt, especially because they had just told me I was dreaming it, but I knew what I saw and the feelings it produced in me. I left that camp a few days later with no other paranormal occurrences. It left me with so many questions about that cabin we've camped in so many times. I searched a bit online recently to try to find anything I could, but all I could find were some old pictures of it and a booking website. I decided I'll email them tomorrow with some questions, but it's probably a new owner by now. If anyone out there hears this and knows anything about Camp Capilino and stayed there and felt a little weird, please let me know in the comments. If I could piece this together even a little more, I would be incredibly happy. I want to know who that girl was and what happened in that place. Hello, I hope you are all well. I am sharing this both to pass an interesting story and to hopefully find anyone else with a similar experience in this location. My wife and I were camping last night in the Blue River Reservoir in Oregon. We came here often and decided to explore up FSR 520 and found a cool abandoned bridge far back in the woods over Cook Creek. The spot was beautiful, and we set up over the river on this long abandoned bridge over the creek. If you have ever been in the Oregon woods, you know that they can give off a creepy vibe, and this was no exception. But it really was a dream campsite. Being 40 feet directly over a river, while on a bridge with limbs growing everywhere, is not an everyday spot. I'll also throw in for background that there was no one within at least 3 miles of us, and we had to hike in quite a ways from our car. We explored around the area for quite a while, and did not come across anything out of the ordinary besides a pair of shoes and the name Mona written in the ash on a rock. While we were sitting by the fire, I noticed a very bright flash of light over the river and snapped my head up but did not see anything. A few moments later, I was paying closer attention and watched a ball of light float, even with the bridge 40 feet in the air, from one side to the other. It went over 50 feet. The light was very blue. My thought, the first time, was that it had somehow been the headlights and somehow shined through, I don't know. But I would have heard a car, and no man-made light could have made it into this isolated area. This blue light was unlike anything I'd ever seen. I mentioned it to my wife but did not want to freak her out, so I dropped the subject pretty quickly after. Later that night in the tent, we had put the mesh lining up so that we could see outside. My wife gasped and watched as the same blue light floated over the end of the bridge 30 feet away and hovered in the air. After a good bit of time, it shot into the woods. It is late at night and we were obviously scared of someone's headlamp, but it shot away 40 times as quick as any human could go, and we saw nothing attached. Our dog left the tent and stared at that spot for about 10 minutes or so, while also peeking down the side of the bridge very seriously. Has anyone had a similar experience on Forest Development Road 520 in Blue River Reservoir, Oregon, or had any similar experiences in the Pacific Northwest? I'd love to know. So this story is of my experience with a skinwalker. A little background before I begin. This happened when I was 8 years old, and my father told me this story when I got older. My father has had this odd connection to the paranormal since he was just a child, and has many stories, but those can be for another time. He explained that this experience happened during the fall. We had just had one of the hottest summers, so the warm weather lingered a little longer than normal. I had just woken up and needed to use the bathroom. Now, for some context, we live on the Navajo reservation, so that pretty much means that we have no running water, which in turns means no indoor plumbing. So if you need to use the bathroom, you have to make a trip outside. Now, as I had just woken up, I went to my father and asked him to take me outside so I could do my business. I was still half asleep, so my memory is a little fuzzy during this part. As we made our way outside, he told me just to go out as far enough as I could to do my business. Later, as I asked him to recall this story, I asked how far I made it away. He explained that I was not that far, maybe just 15 yards out. As he was waiting, he said that he noticed something moving in the grass. Thinking it was one of our dogs, he said he just kept an eye on it. Thinking that it was his eyes playing tricks on him, he said that the shape moved oddly like a dog army crawling on its stomach, but with its arms in an awkward pose. As it came closer to my father, he said that he knew exactly what it was. He called out my name and told me to get back inside. Not wanting to scare me, he said that this thing noticed him and turned its head towards him as if to acknowledge him and began crawling backwards. As I got back inside, I instantly went back to bed, and my father then woke my mother up and whispered there is a skinwalker outside, and it was 2 feet from Sonny Boy. My mother got up quickly, and they both went into the kitchen to see if they could see where it went. As they continued to look, my father said he spotted it. It was still in the tall grass in the same position, except now it began to stand up and make a quick dash behind a tree. Losing sight of it, they decided to stay up and just make sure it did not return. After about an hour or so, my mom said she heard something hit the side of the house next to the living room. Getting up from the couch, they went back to the window to see if it made its way back. Peeking from the window, my mother and father said they noticed a black shape standing at the corner of the house. As soon as they spotted it, they began to pray in Navajo. At this point, my father said he went outside to stand up to it, but after a few minutes of looking, he came back and told my mother it was gone. After he told me this, my skin began to crawl, and I just hate coming to terms with how close this thing was.
Two weeks ago, I went camping with my best friend and his girlfriend in eastern Texas. We're from the Fort Worth area, but we like to travel in the outskirt areas when it comes to camping. We don't like to be around a lot of people, and we really just want to get away from everybody, to be honest. That's the whole point in camping, realistically. We had a late start. It was kind of a last-minute decision like the night prior. So that night prior, we pretty much spent a couple hours at Walmart trying to get everything that we needed for that weekend that was the next day, basically. It was a Thursday, and we decided to go on the next day on a Friday. It was a split decision, but Sometimes those are the best times when you just have nothing planned and just go for it. So, we get pretty much everything that we needed for that weekend. Fast forward to Friday, and we're on our way. Even then, we had a late start. We didn't arrive to our destination until about 1 p.m. In all honesty, the reason for our delayed arrival was totally my fault. We were eating over at this Tex-Mex Mexican joint place, and I had way too much spicy food that morning. I mean, from the peppers to the salsa. I like spicy food, but I think that I, for one, now I'm speaking for myself, I went overboard. I was hungry, and we were just having a gay old time that morning, and let's just say my body did not agree with the intake of food and spices that I had for that breakfast. So I was constantly in the bathroom, which totally delayed us. Like I said, it was totally my fault, but eventually we had a Imodium in the bathroom cabinet, and that solved the problem, and we were on our way. After about a maybe it was 2.5 hour drive, we finally arrived at the camping site. We all worked together, unpacked my buddy's truck, and started to set everything up, which included the tent, the food, the ice chest, the lawn chairs, the firewood, the basics. It was a nice afternoon. A couple of weeks prior to this, it was just so incredibly hot and humid, it was disgusting. Now, I'm not saying it wasn't humid when we went camping, it definitely was, but you're pretty used to it when you're from Texas. It was partly cloudy in the sky, it had a nice slight chill breeze, and it was a good day to camp. After about 30 minutes, everything was pretty much set up aside from the tent. We knocked that out in about 15 minutes, and then we just sat around and prepared for a late lunch. After we had set everything up, I couldn't help but realize that there wasn't too many other people at this camping location. Now, this campsite is run by the Rangers, but it's not like a huge camping facility, like a big popular one that most people go to, like the RV ones and the KOAs and stuff like that. This one's kind of rural and kind of just out there, like, you kind of learned about it by word of mouth. Like, there's nobody on site that really checks on you. They just have one of those boxes with the money inserts and stuff for you to pick the spot, and there you go. It's almost like a code of honor for honesty, but I know the park rangers stop by to clean the restrooms that are here on site and stuff like that, but you really don't see too many of the rangers. They do pop up periodically, but it's very seldom. Now that I think about it, it's probably a good thing. But unfortunately for us that weekend, it was horribly bad. After we had cooked some burgers up and things of that nature, we enjoyed ourselves with some beers and snacks and just decided just to chillax for the evening and not do anything. We planned on going on a nice little hike the next day. I heard there was a lake over here that I don't remember seeing the last time that we went out here. We've been out here one other time, and that's why we came back for a second time, because we liked it. But it's been a while since we've been out here, so a couple of things had changed. So the evening came, and the sun slowly drifted below the horizon. It was completely and utterly dark. Pitch black. The only thing that you could see in the sky was the moon and the bright stars from above, and the only sounds that you could hear would be from the nearby crickets and the crackling from your fire in the fire pit. By this time, the weather started to change and get a little cooler, which is what I always preferred at least. But my buddy's girlfriend started to get annoyed and put on a sweater and just complain. There's just people out there they'd rather sweat than be comfortable. I never really understood that, but to each their own. We were taking shots of Patron and drinking plenty of beer. All three of us are in our early 20s. My buddy Rob and his girlfriend go to a community college, and myself, I just have a day job, but I'm actually thinking about joining the military. I just really haven't made up my mind yet. My buddy Rob had one too many shots of Patron, and we could tell that he was starting to pass out. Which is absolutely fine. I mean, I'd rather him stop and go to sleep and just have a hangover in the morning and not throw up all over the place. I remember we helped him back into their tent and put him to sleep under the sleeping bag. After we put my buddy Rob to bed, she zipped up the tent and followed me back over to the fire pit, sitting down in the lawn chairs. I reached my hand over to the cooler, grabbed another Corona, and popped off the lid with a can opener. Taking another swig, I could kind of notice that she was kind of checking me out. It was weird. My buddy Rob and her, they've been dating for about 3 months now. She was a sexy-looking hyena, in all means. She was about 4'11", size 5, 125 pounds, rocking a 38D chest. To say it plainly, and keeping this story PG, she was smoking hot. So I just ignored it and just tried to keep it casual by talking about how drunk my buddy was and what we had planned for the next evening and hiking, and maybe we'll do a little fishing or something. I did notice that he had a couple of poles in the back. Things like that. She just nodded and smiled, stood up, and walked slowly over in my direction. I didn't know what she was doing at first until she sat on my lap and leaned into me, and I'm like, whoa, 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 what are you doing? And right when that happened, that's when we heard the howls. She quickly leaned back and hopped off of my lap and stood up, looking into the woods behind us. "What was that?" she asked me. I stood up, just still stunned. One, that my buddy's girlfriend was making a move, and two, what the hell was that howling? It sounded like it was so close to us. We have coyotes and stuff, but we don't have big bad wolves or anything out here. I mean, it's Texas. It's not Montana. I just stood up and just looked around. Like I said before, it's pitch black out here, and there wasn't too many people nearby camping in this location to begin with. I walked over to my backpack. Luckily, it wasn't too far from where I was sitting, and grabbed my air horn, and then I grabbed my... Don't laugh, but I grabbed a little pocket knife. It wasn't in my pocket, so yeah, I know. We weren't that prepared, obviously, but we weren't really expecting anything like this either. So there I was. All we had was a flashlight, an air horn, and a Swiss Army knife. Just staring there, trying to see if we could see any movement or anything amongst the tree line. Nothing. That was until we heard the noises. In my head, I was thinking to myself, what the hell is out here? I looked over at my buddy's girlfriend, and she was just praying or mumbling something in Spanish that I had no idea what she was saying. I grabbed her hand and just told her, just stay put and stay close to the fire. I'll be right back. She grabbed my hand and said, "No, don't go." I told her, "Be fine, I'm just going to check it out a little bit." I released my hand and I walked over towards the wood line. I had to know what the hell was going on. I started to walk towards the wood line, and I had the weirdest feeling that I was being watched. The further that I walked, the more of this weird, eerie feeling that overcame me. I flashed my flashlight all around, and when I flashed my beam straight ahead of me, That's when I saw it. This large black claw gripping the outside of some tree bark like it was hiding behind this tree. When I saw the claw, it freaked me out and I shot the light up about 24 inches or so just to see its face. This giant wolf-like man was creeping behind the woodline behind these trees. Its eyes reflected red against the light from the flashlight, and it snarled at me. I lifted my air horn out, aimed it at this thing, and pulled the trigger on it. As soon as I did, it startled this thing off, and it completely disappeared from view for my flashlight and darted off in the woods behind it. My heart was thumping so bad. I was so afraid, so petrified. What in God's name did I just see? Surely enough, I grabbed my courage back, what courage was left, and I walked back over towards the fire pit where she was waiting. I told her everything that had happened. And that freaked her out even more, but I had to let her know what the hell I saw. I'm not going to keep that kind of thing a secret. I didn't want to stay there. The both of us packed everything up and left my buddy's tent for the last thing to pack up since he was still sleeping inside it sound asleep. He missed all the excitement. We eventually woke him up, tore down his tent, and we got back on the road and we got the hell out of there. I don't think we'll ever go back to that campsite ever again.
My name is Clara. First off, I'd like to say that I'm a big fan, and it would be an honor if you read this story. It is rather short because it happened about 13 years ago, and my memory may be a little blurred on what happened. I apologize in advance. I was around the age of 12. The church I was going to, at the time, had decided to go to a camp. There were cabins, RVs, tents, etc. at this site. If I recall correctly, the site was in Missouri somewhere. I am not a Christian or anything, I am Wiccan. But because I was going to a Christian school, I was suckered into the camp. I absolutely hate camping. I hate being outdoors. I hate nature in general. I am a city girl. I do not belong outdoors. After this incident, I vowed to never go camping ever again. The camp had a nightly worship closing ceremony thing, where the camp band would play worship songs and we would all hear a sermon. We were under the closest pavilion near some woods. I was in the very back row of seats with the woods behind me. The music was not playing at the time, but the youth leader was praying or something like that. I never really paid attention to the prayers, sermons, or songs. I was talking with my stepsister, who was sitting next to me, when I got a very bad feeling, like someone was watching me very intently. I stopped talking, and I investigated the woods. I thought I saw a silhouette of a man right in front of one of the trees. It seemed to be taller than an average man, though. Maybe 7 feet tall. It looked skinny, too, from what I could make out anyway. My sister asked me what was wrong, but I did not want to tell her. She never really believed in supernatural beings. I let it go for a bit, and went back to talking about whatever with my sister, though I still had that creepy feeling. After a few more minutes, though, I heard a stick break and my blood ran cold. I turned back around, and I swear, to whatever I saw, something was over there. It had pale skin, and it was running off on all fours into the woods. From what I could see, it moved much faster than any human possibly could. It honestly looked like it was on all fours or hunched over as it ran off. Once it was gone, I did not feel that strange feeling anymore. I like to think that it was a Wendigo or something similar. Needless to say, I freaked out. I had a full-blown panic attack. The youth leader and the other camp counselors prayed over me, like prayer is going to stop a panic attack. I did eventually calm down on my own, and when I told them what happened and what I saw, the youth leader said it was a demon that was attached to me. Okay, I don't know if it was a demon, but I think it might have been some sort of cryptid. My sister still does not believe that I saw something that night, but I can never forget that creature.
This story is short and to the point. It's not a super scary story, but it's definitely a sighting that happened to me and my cousin last spring. It was in the month of May, and we were born and raised in the area of Portland, Oregon. We were camping on the eastern part of the state near the border of Idaho. We always like to get away, and honestly, Portland's a big city, and when we go camping, we just want to get away from everybody. We always try to find that one place that a lot of people don't know about, that's more secluded and with beautiful scenery. Well, we found it last spring. I don't have any brothers or sisters, and my cousin has 2 other sisters, but he's not really close with either one of them, and we kind of grew up together, so he's more like a brother than anything else. Once we had arrived, we wanted to do a little bit of hiking before that evening's meal. So we grabbed our waters, I grabbed my hiking stick and hat, and we were venturing off into the woods. We've been here one other time, and we were pretty fond of the area. About 30 minutes had passed by, and we started getting this weird feeling like we were being followed. Now, there's wild animals out here, and there's a couple other people that are camping out here as well, but this feeling was nothing of the sort. This was something totally different. I tried to brush it off, and we just continued on our hike. Eventually, we started hearing these weird snapping noises. I'm not trying to be cliche, but we really did. Then the howls came. Somewhere off in the distance. Somewhere behind us. Okay, I think we should turn around and start to head back to camp, my cousin mentioned to me. I agreed, and we made a 180 and we started walking back down the trail. Again, we still had that weird, eerie feeling we were being watched somehow. Yet we didn't see a thing. Fast forward about 35 minutes later, we finally arrived back to our camping spot to see everything completely destroyed. Our food and meats were either gone or flung around in various locations in the dirt. Our chairs were completely destroyed. Pieces of fabric just torn from place to place. Plates, silverware, everything was just completely destroyed, including the ice chest was in several pieces. What could have done that? And why? When we approached everything just a little bit closer, we couldn't help but notice the footprints in the dirt. They looked like wolf prints, but these prints were abnormally large. They were definitely wolf prints, but they were larger than our boots. And I'm a size 10 and my cousin's a size 11. These prints were huge. Whatever it was that tore up our camp was something I can't even explain. But thank God, we were hiking when this had happened.
I'm a 16-year-old girl. This story happened around November of last year at my grandparents' house in upstate New York. Behind their house is farmland, and behind that are many acres of thick woods. There are several trails that have been created through these woods for walking or four-wheeling purposes. I've been going on these trails all my life, and have never truly felt that there is anything to be afraid of in there. I often listen to horror stories about being in the wilderness and sometimes wonder if I will encounter something scary, but I never thought I would. On the day this story takes place, we were at my grandparents' house to celebrate my aunt's birthday. Anytime we are there, me and my cousins always go into the woods to hang out and talk. This time I only went into the woods with one of my cousins, Grace. As we breached the tree line, everything felt normal. However, when we were probably half a mile into the trail, something felt off. My instincts were telling me something was wrong. It felt different than the usual paranoia I mentioned earlier. It felt like I had a real reason to be afraid. I did not mention anything to Grace. I didn't want her to think that I was paranoid or anything like that. As we kept walking, the feeling just did not end. Further into our walk, I swear I heard movement within the trees. I start to feel like we are being watched, and alarm bells start going off in my head. I was about to tell Grace that I think we should turn back, but her attention was focused on the side of the trail and the trees. She stopped walking and said, "What is that?" while pointing into the trees. I tried to see what she was seeing, but I told her I could not see anything. Grace is taller than me, so perhaps she had a better vantage point than I did. "Oh," she said, "there's a deer over there." She slowly creeps into the trees, trying to stay quiet. I told her I think we should go because I was still a little freaked out. She replied telling me to stop talking so I would not scare away the deer. I could barely see her as she made her way close to the supposed deer that I could not see. I was looking around me because Grace's absence made me even more nervous. My heart sinks several seconds later as I hear a blood-curdling scream come from Grace, and then the growing sound of crushing branches as she runs back towards the trail. She comes into view, and I can finally see the thing she saw, and it is no deer. It was an extremely pale humanoid creature, but had a deer head, and it was pursuing her. I was frozen in place until Grace turned to the trail. She screamed for me to run, breaking my paralysis. I did not dare look behind me as we ran away from this creature, but I could still hear that it was chasing us. We managed to break through the trees into the field without it catching us. After that, I could no longer hear it until we reached the house. I believe what Grace and I encountered that day was a Wendigo. It fits the physical description, but I also heard a video from Swamp Dweller recently about deer people, and I think it might even be that. We were in the Great Lakes region though, which is why I do think it might be a Wendigo. I know that it could have caught us and killed us if it wanted to, but I still wonder why it did not. Grace and I have tried to tell our other cousins about it, but none of them really believe us. I hope they never have to experience what we did. One thing is for sure, I will never return to those woods. I and some of my buddies used to go to this place called Profile Rock in Freetown, Massachusetts. Late at night, sometimes between 2 and 3 in the morning. One night during the summer, I go to Profile Rock with 3 of my friends at 2:30 a.m., just to mess about and explore. Now, I did not know this at the time, but Profile Rock in the area we were in is part of the area called the Bridgewater Triangle, which is a site of alleged paranormal activities and one of the most haunted areas in the state that I live in. Continuing, we climbed Profile Rock itself, stayed on top of it for maybe 3 to 4 hours, and then we decided to leave. Now, as you are leaving Profile Rock, you must go down this long path that is about 2 miles long to get back to where we parked our car. 2 of my friends are walking about 20 to 30 feet in front of me, and my other friend, now I will never know why I turned around. I did not have a feeling like someone was watching us. I just simply turned because, besides the moonlight shining through the trees in the certain areas, we only had cell phone flashlights to make our way around. I remember turning around and seeing someone running at us from about 150 feet away, full speed. What threw me off was not that they were running at us, it was how they were running. You know how a zombie walks in a horror movie, dragging one leg, almost limping? That is how this quote-unquote person was running at us. At first, I did not say anything and possibly assumed it was one of my friends or someone that was already in the area. Maybe they were injured and needed assistance. That was until this person made it to the area of the path where the moonlight reached through the trees and gave them some perspective. What I saw still chokes me up to this day. Have you ever seen a child try to draw a person? How they make a stick figure almost most of the time? That's exactly how this person looked. I caught maybe a 10-second glance as it was running under the moonlight, but I saw no distinguishable facial features. No eyes, no mouth, and no ears. Its arms and legs looked like that of an extremely malnourished person, only completely black, and it didn't look like skin or any type of clothing from what I could see. I almost can't even describe it, to be honest, and you could blatantly tell it wasn't a mask or one of those Halloween blacked out suits. I recall calling out to my friend in a panicked voice, who was walking ahead of me a few trees away. I shined my cell phone light on him as he was walking where I was looking, and I could tell right away from his facial expression that I wasn't the only one seeing things. It was now maybe 40 feet away from us, almost the same distance as our friends in front of us. Me and my friend just took flight and started running. My two other friends in front of me shot around and asked us what was wrong, and I replied, "Just run," and all four of us jetted for our car. I remember taking a glance back as we were running. There was nothing there, even though whatever was chasing us would certainly be on our tails by now. We all hopped in the car, and my friend who was walking with me yells, "Dude, tell me you saw that. What the heck was that?" I told him I seen the same thing. I asked him to describe to all of us what he saw, and he described literally the exact same thing I witnessed. By now, my other two friends are thinking we are joking around or messing with them, until my friend who was walking with me swore on his father who had died not even a month ago. I was kind of frustrated, to be honest, because I did not believe my other two friends did not see it, as they turned around to question why we were running. But I guess it ultimately does not matter now. We went back there with a few more people the day after and witnessed nothing. Of course, I will never know what it was, or who it was, or what it wanted. But I know one thing, that there is no way two people both imagined seeing the same stick figure specter in the woods. My husband and I live in East Tennessee near Big South Fork National River and Recreation Area. While we have never experienced anything here, we have had a few odd things happen on our travels around the national parks. We have been listening to your show for months now, and we have thought we would share an experience with the swamp. When we were in college, we traveled to national parks every chance we got. In the summer of 2018, we took a small trip to Congaree National Park in South Carolina. I want to pause here to make a brief introduction to Congaree for those who may not know what it is. Congaree is an ancient floodplain, the largest old-growth bottomland hardwood forest in the United States. It has the tallest trees in the eastern United States and one of the highest canopies in the world. Congaree is home to the Congaree River, which floods the whole area, requiring the park to build an elevated boardwalk so you can get from point A to point B without having to wade knee-deep in alligator and venomous snake-infested water. So basically, it is a swamp covered in big trees. My husband and I got to the park midday, stopped at the visitor center to make sure we chose the quickest trail to get to our campsite, and we took off walking. Our campsite was over a mile from the visitor center, partially along the boardwalk before jutting off on a side trail through the woods. We found our site at the campground, set up our tent, and then explored the park for the rest of the day. We knew it was going to rain around dinner time, so we had left our cooking equipment and food in our car at the front of the park. We ate under the shelter as a giant storm blew over. By the time the storm was gone, the sun had set. At this time of year, the lightning bugs gather in the thousands for mating purposes, and people travel all over the world to come watch this event. What happens is that all the fireflies will light up and then go dim at the same time. During this week-long event, visitors are not allowed to use flashlights. So, here we are walking 1.7 miles back to our campsite with the only light coming from 1,000 lightning bugs every few seconds. There were quite a few people along the first stretch of the boardwalk watching the flies. The storm had caused a tree to fall across the boardwalk, and we had to crawl over and under and through this tree to make it to the other side to get to our campsite. We gave a heads up to a few people that we ran across that there was a tree down and they will have to cross to get back to their cars. After a mile or so, the boardwalk splits. Right to continue the boardwalk trail around the park, or left to go to the trail that leads to our tent. At this crossroad, in the near strobe light effect of the fireflies, we saw it. I do not know what it was, but it was there. 10 feet ahead, there was a white figure about 5 feet tall. It was not moving. It was just standing there. We had been walking side by side, but I stepped behind my husband so he could walk ahead. As we got closer, we both examined the figure. There were not any real distinguishable features. It looked like there was a head and shoulders, but there was no face, hair, or even an outline of a body under the white glow. As we continued to inch closer, the features never became discernible. We passed within 6 inches of this thing. I kept my gaze forward, fearful it would turn around and not have eyes or something. With it a few yards behind us, I built up the courage to turn around. When I did, it was still there standing perfectly still, fading into the darkness of the trees. We made it to our tent without any issues and slept terribly through the night, waiting on something to happen, but nothing ever did. So, my question for the swamp: what did we see? Was it a ghostly shadow of a person who used to travel through there in years past? Or was it a lone person wearing a raincoat admiring the firefly miles away from other people? Or was it something different? I'd love to know. The experience that I'm about to recount is one of the most terrifying incidents that have ever happened to me. At the time of this encounter, I was 17 years old, and my family decided to visit our cottage for a weekend during the warm months of July. Before I continue, I would just like to specify that I am a female. My family's cottage is deep within the countryside of Ontario, Canada. I had recently lost a lot of weight because I had taken up the habit of going on long walks every afternoon, and I was not going to let staying at the cottage ruin my new routine. One evening, I decided to go for a walk for a couple of hours after dinner. Just as the sun was setting, now that I am older, I realize how foolish this idea was. For context, my family cottage is in a very rural area. There are barely any cars, no streetlights, and the area is heavily wooded on both sides of the skinny one-lane road that stretches for kilometers in both directions. At the beginning of my walk, it was still somewhat bright outside, and I decided to call my friend while I was out to help pass the time. Looking back, I guess I must have been so engrossed in the conversation that I did not realize how quickly the sun was setting. Before I knew it, the sun was almost completely gone. By this point, I was about 30 minutes away from my family's cottage on foot. During my walk, I only saw about 2 cars pass the entire time that I was out. Eventually, I told my friend that I was heading back because of how dark it had gotten. Just as I turned around on the long stretch of road, I saw an old beat-up pickup truck coming down the lane. At first, I did not think anything was off. In fact, I even made a joke to my friend over the phone that wouldn't it be hilarious if that pickup truck ended up turning around? In hindsight, that was an extremely stupid comment to make. The pickup truck sped down the road and out of sight. However, about 5 minutes later, before I knew it, it must have pulled into somebody's driveway and made a U-turn because it was coming right towards me, not trying to hit me, but just traveling in the opposite direction down the road. I was a little bit perturbed, but I did not initially think that anything was wrong or amiss. After all, there was a small convenience store that you could probably get to in the same amount of time, if you speed like a maniac. So naive 17-year-old me just brushed it off. But things soon took a turn for the worst. Not even 5 minutes later, the old pickup truck turned around again, and this time, it was clear that the driver had decreased speed enough to get a good look at me through the window. This time, I totally freaked out. I told my friend about the incident and was panicking. I've heard way too many scary stories on YouTube to know where this was going. I told my friend over the phone what was happening, and she told me to hang up and call my dad, who was at the cottage with the rest of my family. I did as she said, and as soon after, I saw the truck make a U-turn in someone's driveway and come back in my direction again. The truck passed me once more, but each time it did, its speed decreased, which set me on edge and made me feel incredibly uncomfortable. After all these years, I still cannot fully describe the sheer amount of panic that I felt on that summer evening. Right before I called my dad, I was trying to figure out my next course of action. There were woods on either side of the street. I decided that if the truck came back around, and if the driver attempted to get out and pursue me, I would make a run for the woods in order to get as far away from them as I could. I finally called my dad and told them what was going on. I could not help but almost cry. He asked me for directions. I told him that if he made a right from our cottage and kept going for about 5 minutes or so, that he would eventually spot me. By now it was pitch black outside. The only source of light I had was the moon and my iPhone's flashlight. During this time, the truck made another turn and once again drove by me extremely slowly. This time it drove up a couple of rural driveways down the road, and I saw that it was idling with its headlights off. At that moment in time, I did not care if I was overreacting. I genuinely thought that whoever was in that truck was planning on abducting me. I have read countless stories online and have watched way too many documentaries to know where this situation could potentially lead me. Luckily, just as I was about to lose hope, I saw the headlights of another car approaching. My phone rang. It was my dad. He flashed his lights twice and I bolted as fast as I could to his car. The problem was, in order to make it to his car, I had to pass the driveway that the old truck was parked in. This was a moment that I just winged it. I did not care. I just thought to myself, if I run as quickly as possible, I'll make it. And if someone gets out of the truck and chases me, I'll run into the woods. Looking back, who knows if that idea would have even been safe. It could have been suicide for all I know. I took the risk and made it past the truck and finally to my dad's car. I opened the door and got into the front seat breathing heavily. My dad was glad to know I was safe, and I was glad to see him. At first I thought we were going to start the car and bolt right out of there. But my dad wanted to do a test. He parked his car and turned off the headlights. He told me he wanted to see if the truck driver I described would try to make a run for it, or at least try to continue the search for me. After 5 minutes, it was clear the truck driver was smarter than we had thought, as the vehicle remained hidden. We drove back to the cottage and called the cops. There was not much they could do because I did not catch the plate, and technically the driver had not done anything to me. Looking back, maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was a local concern that a young girl was walking alone at night. I don't know. But I do know one thing. The events that transpired that night did not sit well with me. My gut told me everything I needed to know. Better safe than sorry. I want anyone to know who is hearing this that no matter how silly you feel about any situation, always trust your gut. To this day, I am 21 now, I have never gone for a walk at my family's cottage alone ever again. That situation has made me paranoid, but probably for the better. Hello, I used to be a police officer in the state of Ohio. You may think this is a made-up story, but I know damn well what I saw. So, me and my friend Dave were at a hamburger place. It was a normal area, nothing excited, nothing too bad. So it was about 1:30 a.m. Yes, for whatever reason, I remember the time. We got this call from dispatch, saying there was a call from a woman who had been hearing strange noises coming from the woods by her house. We got in the car and sped through the road. Well, we came to Rocky Road. It was very strange. We pulled up to the house. There were barely any houses in the area. The woman started saying how she heard growling from her backyard and a man screaming. We walked to the woods. We decided we should split up. I started walking and walking until it felt like hours, honestly. Then I found a clearing in these dang woods. It was weird. It was just dirt, but there were no trees or plants growing anywhere, not even grass. What the heck is this? I said to myself. I tried to radio for Dave. No answer. I tried again. No answer. I heard something and I turned my head in that direction. I do not know how to describe it. It was a huge, bone-looking thing. It looked like a human spine. It had bony feet that looked like dinosaur feet and sharp claws. But it was all bone, except its head. It was like a bunny's head, except it had a large, monster mouth with sharp teeth and red glowing eyes. This thing was like 7 feet tall. I could not run. I was absolutely frozen. I could not move. The thing stared me down. I started shaking in my boots. It stepped closer. Suddenly, I was able to break out of my trance, and I booked it out of there and ran back to the patrol car. I radioed for help, and Dave came running out. I stepped out of the car and told him everything. He, of course, did not believe me until I heard the other cop cars coming. I will never forget this. We heard a gunshot go off. We both jumped out, and there was a hole through the patrol car's window. I looked into the woods and there was a man in the bushes. He was all bloody. He had no eyes, just blood covering his body. He stood up. He was naked, covered in blood, and he ran. Dave ran after this guy, pulled his gun, and told him to stop. I screamed for Dave. When 2 officers arrived, I did not really tell them what I saw. Dave came back, and he looked like he had crapped himself. We started to drive away slowly after all of this had been processed. I asked him what had happened, and he told me he saw more of them. I asked him, what do you mean more of them? There were men, women, and children all bloody and naked. I swear I almost soiled myself. His theory was the scariest part. He said that thing I saw in the woods probably takes people and kills them and makes it into some sort of like zombie army. I am still pretty scared. I quit a year after that, and I hope it never finds me. I don't care who believes this story. I know what I saw, and I'm definitely getting out of this town as quickly as I can. So this is the story of my most dreadful experience. It may not be the most eventful, but just remembering it makes me shiver. The story happened in Central Europe, so to set the story, once upon a time as a kid, I used to go to a local mountain range for a special camp to combat my asthma with fresh air. I loved the place and decided to go and refresh my memories with my husband last year. The area is secluded and full of deep forest. We got accommodations in a small hut about 5 kilometers away from the old camp and decided to go there in the morning and follow a few tracks from there. The main camp building used to be an old stone building, an old hunting house for the local nobility. The house was desolate, windows were broken, roof fallen, completely abandoned. I got a bit upset, but we decided to continue to other familiar locations. About 5 more kilometers away from the abandoned camp was another place I used to love, a menhir stone. Just like in most parts of Europe, there used to be a Celtic settlement here, and though it is not Stonehenge, you can find menhir stones in the deeper woods. This one was about 3 meters, or 9 feet tall for you Americans. It was surrounded by a small clearing. We went closer to it and decided to continue around it, down the northern side of the mountain, and around to get back to our accommodation. Immediately upon passing around the stone, I got a weird feeling of being watched, but I didn't mention anything at first. I have never felt this way around there. These were my woods. We continued. Expecting to bump into other hikers, the place used to be swarming with people, but oddly, we saw no one for hours. The strange feeling was just getting worse, and the woods were getting eerily quiet. We have not seen anything move since we had passed that stone, not even a bird or a hare. I noticed my hubby was getting a bit jumpy too. Looking behind us every few stops, my husband is a big outdoors guy, and I have never seen him nervous about anything in the wild. He is a big guy with over 10 years of MMA training, but even he was scared. We stopped talking and started walking as fast as we could when we turned around a rock and saw a car wreck. An old car with no tires and no windows in the middle of nowhere. At that time, the woods stopped being silent. It felt as if there was a whisper coming from all over, and some branches snapped just behind us. No words. We just booked it and ran. The whole remaining distance, about 4 more kilometers. We just ran. I cannot describe the relief upon reaching the hut. The owner was there. He was renting out his upper floor to hikers, and looked at us with amusement. We must have looked like we had seen a ghost. He later asked where we went. We said nothing about being scaredy cats, but my hubby would be too ashamed to admit that. We mentioned the stone though, and the guy said, "Oh, and from which side did you approach it?" the guy asked. We stared at him. People say that on the north of this one, there is a Celtic burial ground, and there were more of them marking it. I do not know what to think, and I know it sounds cliche and fake, but heck, it happened, and we have even decided to not discuss it further because it makes us feel all kind of weird. So what do you guys think? Has anybody ever had a similar experience? This is a story that was relayed to me by an ex-girlfriend back in 2002 on Vancouver Island, Canada. So I am guessing it took place sometime in the 1990s. She said that her best friend was going camping with her mom, her sister, and her other friend. They wanted a little more privacy than is offered by the provincial parks, so they decided to go down some exceptionally long, winding logging roads. People who know Vancouver Island know that these roads go deep into the Pacific rainforest, and they are very remote. Many of them are private roads that are often locked or blocked off, and you are not really supposed to be on them. Anyway, they decided that they were far enough out and found an ideal clearing near a stream. The girls had just gotten out of the car after a long ride and were stretching and preparing to unpack their tent and gear. Then, her friend looked at the end of the clearing near the woodline. There was this thick black fog the size of a person that was just hovering there. She began to scream and freak out, and the other girls ran towards her to see what the problem was, when they all claimed to have seen it too. They immediately just threw everything that they had unpacked on the ground and ran for the car. They locked the doors and sped away from there as fast as they could. As they looked back from the car as they were leaving, they saw the black fog had moved out into the main road and was traveling towards them, seemingly following them. They were all crying and panicking and accelerated as fast as they could without losing control of the vehicle. They drove back to town in silence, not knowing what to think about what had happened. A few weeks after this incident, the local news reported that a woman's body had been found on this same exact road, awfully close to where they were going to camp. The police did say the woman was a homicide victim. I am unsure of any information on if they ever identified the woman or were able to locate her killer. Her friends always wondered if this was perhaps the spirit of the murder victim they had encountered deep in the forest. We had walked out of our freshman dorm to head for the park. To both my roomies and to my surprise, I randomly lifted my head, spread my arms, and said, "There's magic in the air," which was very uncharacteristic of me. We kind of just forgot about it and headed off. In hindsight, that must have been the beginning. We walked down the street to the park, toting our guitars. Our plan was to practice for our guitar final the following day while enjoying the peace of the park. About a block ahead of us, spanning the sidewalk, was a statue of a black German shepherd lying in profile, gazing across the other side of the street. I wondered, out loud, why anyone would block a sidewalk with a large dog statue. My roomie just shrugged, apparently very uninterested in what I had to say. I slowed more and more, studying the statue. It was so odd to me. Then I realized that I saw a glint in one of the eyes, and that it was not a statue. That stopped me entirely in my tracks. It was breathing, but did not twitch an ear, nor move to glance at our approach. Though it must have heard our footsteps, it just lay there, ears erect, and pointed toward the other side of the street, eyes gazing in the same direction. I knew how dogs acted, and did not feel comfortable with this one's behavior. I had no intention of trying to step over it or facing it if it decided to turn its attention toward us. I pulled, protesting my roomie. She had never had pets and was not an animal lover. As well, affectionately, she was not the brightest bulb in the pack, to the other side of the street to continue our trek down to the park. I stared across the street at it, but could not tell what it was looking at. It never moved. When we reached the park, we sat at a picnic table and began practicing our chords. Soon thereafter, a small tabby Manx cat walked up to us. Being a cat lover, I stopped to see if it would come up to us and make friends. Instead, it began running in circles around our table, round and round, increasing speed as it ran. My mouth must have been hanging open as I watched this in complete surprise. Then it stopped, shook itself, and began running around us in the other direction, again increasing speed as it ran. What the holy hell was going on here? Even my roomie stopped playing to watch. It then, fluidly, swarmed up a tree into a branch overhanging our table, and laid comfortably down, settled its little chin onto its little paws, and grazed down with its round golden eyes directly right into my eyes. It looked kind of smug. No other word to describe that look. I was stunned and could not figure out what was happening. Then I surprised myself with a thought. You've just been marked. Now, I was already uneasy after the encounter with the strange, very still shepherd, so my discomfort jumped up several notches. I told my roomie that the cat, who was still staring down at me at this point, was not behaving normally. She thought I was making too much out of it and wanted to continue practicing. She did not even glance up at the creature. I knew that any of my animal-loving friends would have been just as astonished about these incidents as I was, if I could even get them to believe me. I was on my own. Dusk was approaching. I glanced across the park and immediately noticed a huge wolf-like creature skulking into some of the bushes and trees by the woods. It was canine, but did not move like a dog, nor look like a dog in the distance across the park, which was probably about 3/4 of a football field. It was enormous. I just could not believe my eyes. Now what? I stared and stared. Then, in the spot where this thing disappeared into the bushes, a figure appeared. In the twilight, I could see it was very tall, human-shaped, and I could tell that it looked like its clothes were completely tattered. My immediate thought was that it had been savaged by that wolf thing. My immediate thought was that I would have definitely heard if there was some sort of confrontation going on just outside the tree line, you know? There had been and was no sound. I watched as it shambled across the darkening park toward our table. We had been the only people in the park this entire time. It seemed to be dragging a leg. It had long, scraggly hair and long pointed fingernails on an exceptionally long finger, hanging limply at its side. That was it for me. I was suddenly terrified. A quick glance showed me that the little Manx cat was still staring down at me. I was not going to wait for the figure to reach me. I grabbed my guitar and took off, and my roomie scrambled after me, hollering. Honestly, I'm not really ashamed to say I left her behind. Upon reaching campus, I crossed a little crosswalk to head for my dorm. As I crossed, an old arthritic white dog was crossing from the other side. As we passed one another, it stopped dead, crouched, and stared right at me. Its eyes were pure white. I started to freak out more and back away from it. It moved only its head, seeming to follow me with those eyes, not moving its body from where it was crouched. Twisted, uncomfortable even. All the people around us were staring at us. A car drove up to the crosswalk, headlights now on, and began blowing its horn to move the dog. It did not budge. It just kept craning its neck towards me. My head blew out. Now hysterical, I ran the rest of my way to the dorm and crawled under my covers. I have never been the same, and only a few people have ever heard this story or even believed me. Which is so frustrating because I am a stable and honest person, and they know it. Anyway, that all happened just as I have written, and I have no answers. So if anybody here on this show might have some, please comment them down below. Also, no, I don't plan on going to investigate those woods at the park.
I had just gone on a canoeing trip with my dad and 3 other pairs of father and son. Me, my cousin Trent, my future sister-in-law's brother Luke, and a close friend of mine, Jack. These aren't their real names. The trip was a week long, and we were exhausted. My dad had got us a huge Airbnb somewhere near Minneapolis for us to spend the night before heading back to the Midwest. We arrived at the house a little before sunset, and Trent and I decided to rush into the house and pick our beds before the other 2 guys could. We picked the 2 beds in the attic, which was super clean and had all the fun things in it, like the only TV in the house and a ping pong table. Our dads had gotten us some apple pie, so we went downstairs to the kitchen to get it. When we got back upstairs, we noticed it had gotten extremely hot, so we opened all the windows and played some Monopoly to pass the time. After I had won a Monopoly, since I'm a Monopoly god, we got bored and decided to explore the house. We started observing the house a bit more closely and noticed the wallpaper throughout the entire house was a bunch of little girls. Every picture in the house was of a different little girl. We started saying the house was haunted as a joke since it gave off some creepy vibes. But nothing had happened to us, so we couldn't confirm it was haunted. We went into the kitchen and explored that a little bit. We found what we thought was the pantry and opened it. We noticed the door had a lock on it, which we thought was silly since we thought it was just a pantry. When we opened the door, we noticed that it wasn't a pantry, but actually a staircase to the basement. There were no light switches or lights at all, so we dared each other to go down there and look around. Luke went down first, and we could see him turn the corner of the stairs, and all we saw was his face go straight white. He immediately ran up the stairs and back to the attic, where he sat on one of the beds panting and just staring. He said it was really sketchy, and immediately my cousin wanted to see it for himself. So we all followed him down to the basement, and then when Trent turned the corner, his face went as equally white, and he ran up the stairs. We went after him, and he said the same thing as Luke did earlier. We also noticed all the windows had closed again, which was weird because we locked them open. I decided it was my turn to go to the basement, so I and Jack went down. I pulled my phone out as a flashlight and turned the corner. I can only assume my face went as white when I did it too. The walls were all white, and there was a sink in the center of the room with a chain dangling from it. The door at the back that led outside was bolted shut and covered in scratch marks. And the scariest part was the walls and the sink were all covered in blood. I ran upstairs panting and waiting for Jack to come after me. We waited a little bit, and Jack came up the stairs, his face dead white and panting. The scratches on the door, the blood, and the basement lock on the outside of the door, so that whatever was down there couldn't get out. More creepy stuff happened to us that night. It all probably could have been explained, so I won't include it. But the next morning when we were leaving, we noticed a list of rules on the kitchen table. They were all normal rules, like don't touch this, or this light switch is broken. But the last rule, number 9, said, under no circumstances are you to go into the basement.
Have you ever heard of the Wendigo? They say it is a monster that has the antlers of a deer and the putrid smell and looks of a rotting corpse. Legend says, in the times of the Native American culture, that during harsh times when food was little, people would resort to cannibalism, which would slowly turn you into a monster, a cryptid if you will, that stalks and lures unsuspecting victims to their death. This is the story about my encounter with this cryptic creature. The night was frigid, and I and my best friend, who I will call C for this story, decided that we were going to go boar hunting. A boar is a wild pig that is invasive all over the globe, and a few nights back, we spotted a group of them at the feeder in the back of C's pasture. So, here is a quick layout of the property. C has 2 ponds, one on the side of his house and the other in the back of his property. And in the front of the back pond, we built a hunting stand around the tree. I and C were in the stand. We were both equipped with 30-06 hunting rifles. It was close to 10 p.m., and yet we have not seen a single pig. We were getting tired by this time and began packing stuff up. I decided to take one last look at the clearing at the very back of the pasture. And until this very day, I wish I did not. On my rifle, I have an ultraviolet flashlight equipped. Animals cannot see the light being displayed. While shining the light in the brush, I noticed something unusual. It was an animal I had never noticed before, or in my case, ever seen in my life. This creature seemed to be freakishly tall, considering that all I could see were its bright yellow eyes about 7 to 8 feet in the tree line. This utterly confused and terrified me. Without thinking, I fired a round at it, missing, which only seemed to agitate whatever this creature was. Because as soon as I shot this thing, it bolted towards us, sprinting on its hind legs. Now, it was probably roughly 300 yards or so from the clearing to the stand, and while it was sprinting toward us at an almost impossible speed, considering it was zigzagging, I managed to fire another shot and hit it mid-mass. This seemed to stop it, because it fell on the ground and started screaming this metallic screech that just about deafened me. In shock, it stood back up and got the hell out of there limping, but still incredibly fast back into the woods. I and C, not knowing what the heck just went down, or what we should even do, left everything in the hunting stand and booked it back to the house, and made sure to lock everything that could be opened. We did not sleep much that night, and never felt safe staying out past dark outside ever again. The year 2003 might as well have been an alternative reality in the pages of a book, or on screen in a film. It felt normal for a 14-year-old to disappear into the woods on foot until sunset. Bikes and skateboards were infinitely more common than cell phones, and the world just felt like a simpler place, like it had room to breathe. Bigger, even. Everything was bigger. And the place where the horizon skimmed the land was always unknown. Unknown was a promise to draw you in, and in that same whisper, set a chill in your bones as it teased countless dark and murky frontiers. Every Friday, I would go to a local skating rink with my friends, Connor and Tom. The rink was the only place open after 8 p.m. in this little Connecticut town that locked its doors and dimmed its lights at sunset. The charm had already worn off. The skating rink smelled constantly of old socks, and we had struck out with every girl in the building, and Cotton Eye Joe had been so overplayed we didn't care where he came from or where he went. That is when the idea hit me. There's no one keeping us here. and our parents are not coming until 10 p.m. Let's explore outside in the woods. Connor and Tom were eager to follow me through the unguarded doors, and the high school sophomore behind the admission counter did not look up once from her magazine. We were free to roam the town, the silent town in this sleepy little woods. Despite a slight blue cast of summer twilight still laying a blue haze on everything around us, everything was pretty dark. After a little deliberation about where to go, we had nearly settled on a nearby gas station with the ambition to load up on candy. That is until Tom suggested we check out the woods. After all, we could get candy at any time, but these woods were far from our usual backyard stretch of trees. These were untouched lands, waiting to be seen for the first time. Eagerly, we made our way towards the place where the pavement ended and the trees began. The expanse of forest was so dense and so neatly juxtaposed to the parking lot and the skating rink, it almost felt as though the parking lot was a terminal, the cracked gravel of our jumping-off point to another world. As we were taking our first steps off the pavement, I looked behind me to see if we were being watched. Connor and Tom were already fading into the dark of the trees, but I wanted to be sure we were not being watched or followed. Small towns like this have real eager cops, bored to stone and ready to spring to life at the slightest disturbance. No cops, no witnesses to trespassing. I noticed something, however. An illuminated window in the concrete of the building we exited from. This was not part of the skating rink, but rather situated behind it. An apartment of some kind, a residence in a strange location maybe. I had seen the occupant before. It was an elderly woman, built like she had a scarecrow in her family tree, and I always wondered how she managed to sleep on weekends with the hum and thump of the rink insulated by only a few feet of concrete. More than that, I wondered why, in this sedated little town, did she have bars over her windows, and of all things a metal shutter over her front door. I turned into the woods and ran to Connor and Tom before they could get too far ahead of me. Connor was easy to catch, as he had a doctor's penlight in his hand, shining the most ineffective circle of light on the ground ahead of him. I remarked that we still had enough light from the blue gaze to see ahead of us, and he might as well save it. After all, our expedition had been impulsive, and the penlight would be our only beacon once that last light of day was truly gone. "Where's Tom?" I asked. "Dunno. He drifted out of sight. Maybe he went ahead." I rolled my eyes and replied, "He's hiding nearby. The guy sees in the dark like a cat, and I know exactly what he's up to. He's going to jump out and scare us the second we let our guard down." Connor groaned. This was Tom's game, and he knew it was as well, and I just didn't want to be a part of it. I yelled out, "Quit screwing around, Tom. We're going to go ahead without you." We got no reply, as I expected. Connor and I marched forward. The trees were dense, but there were clear spaces to walk in between them. Slowly, the whoosh of passing cars of the road behind us fell away, as the lights from the parking lot did as well. 15 minutes into this adventure had not revealed any more sightings of Tom, and we had not heard the rustle of his footsteps or the muttering under his breath that typically preceded one of his ambushes. I became less occupied with him as we progressed deeper into the trees. There was a distinct feeling out here, an awareness not felt in other places. Do not stand in the shopping mall or at McDonald's and soak in the reality of your surroundings. Something about this canopy of tree, the ever-receding columns dissolving into distant black, made your senses vibrate. The urgency of being a trespasser was ever present, although we were trespassing on no one's land as far as I knew. It was a seldom felt combination of being an adventurer, but also somehow of being prey. The second notion was becoming more intense, and I did my best to push it back out of my thoughts. As Connor and I pushed forward with timidness that was increasing every moment, something suddenly crashed into my thoughts. I felt like I was repeating something I had done before. This brand new place felt awfully familiar, as if I were recalling a dream or a favorite place I'd visited often in childhood. I was overcome with an intense deja vu. I did not say anything to Connor as I noticed the light in his hand casting a trembling circle on the ground ahead. I knew he was scared, and I did not want to feed his anxiety. Connor stopped, and I stopped along with him. He stammered just enough that I expected him to make a plea to return to the parking lot, but his words stopped me just as suddenly as he had. Dude, I just got major deja vu. I had not said a word to Connor about mine, and he was clearly rattled by whatever it was he was feeling. I still did not want to scare him, and so I laughed and made some half-hearted joke about it. There was something interesting ahead, and I wanted to see it. A shimmer of white between the trees just a few yards ahead. There were a few, still, and standing tall, like pillars between the tree trunks. With a few persuasive words, Connor walked side by side with me to investigate. We cleared the sprawling tangle of trees into a clearing. The first thing we encountered since the woods was this feeling of deja vu, which was growing stronger. I looked to the farthest horizon to see a sharp hillside climbing ahead of us. Just above the hillside, I felt the source of my deja vu. I cannot seem to explain it any better than that. I felt like I was a magnet, and my opposite magnetic pole was just at the top of that ridge. Night had settled enough now that this hill was just a sprawling black swell on the horizon. Something more captivating was just in front of us, however. There were stark white trees stripped of their branches, bark shredded like tissue paper, rigid and tall in the clearing. It's like they were struck by lightning, Connor said, his voice drifting with uncertain wonder. I did not know enough to comment, but I knew this was abnormal. Before I could take another step, I saw a black mass curled up beneath one of the trees. The Xerox white of the trunks was invisible in the night, but all the other details around them, Connor included, were glazed in darkness. The tiny spot of Connor's penlight was waning a faint orange on the ground. It provided nearly no assistance. I stepped back and pointed out the shape on the ground. Look, I explained in a hissy whisper. It's Tom. He thinks he's got us. I whispered a hushed plan to Connor. Tom thought he was slick, curled up in his black trench coat. Well, the black-clad aspiring vampire was not getting the glory tonight. Connor arranged with me as I explained that we would nonchalantly stroll by Tom, acting if we had not seen him. I knew Tom would leap up at us and scream the moment we turned our backs to him, and so the plan was to immediately whip around and tackle him when he launched his assault, screaming right back in his face. Connor walked in step with me, ready to deploy. We walked closer to the black mass. It was knee-height or so, and shook subtly as we walked closer. These next few steps would take us by it, and we were ready. As we approached, it was just over a yard to our left. I slowed my pace and just barely kept it in my peripheral vision. It began to rise, and rise, and rise. I am frozen. I do not know when I stopped. I didn't consciously choose to. I just seized. The mass unfurls and stands taller than Tom ever could. There is no indication of clothing. There is no face. There is only movement of black shapes, fluid and smooth in their movement. Maybe legs? Long things that look like arms? I do not know. It is tall, and it is way too tall. It is standing on two legs now, and it's just so tall. I am cranking up my neck. I have to look up. I do not know if Connor is still near me, and I'm not thinking clearly. I'm just reacting. Is it a deer? Why do I think it is a deer? It's definitely not a deer, but the legs are knobby and thin like one. But it's much too tall. A protrusion, maybe a head mass, sits on top of a swaying shape. Like the hill beyond us, the body in front of me is silhouetted in black. Is it a different kind of black? It almost feels like it's darker than black. Suddenly, this thing leans forward onto its arms. It is too close for comfort. It is too close to us now. I still cannot move. It is on 4 legs. Maybe? Are these legs? What is even happening? It bounds off into the woods in the opposite direction, towards the hills. Maybe it's a dog? It's not a dog. My brain is handing me pictures to recognize what I am seeing, and I must reject each image. It stands on 2 legs, but it runs on 4. It has a head. It is thin, or just looks thin because it is tall. The appendages seemed strong, too strong to be frail, but wiry all the same. Connor is still here. Connor is calmly telling me that we have to go. I am coming back from the shock. Reality is the outlet, and I am the fork. Everything surges all at once. Connor is right, and my head pivots in all directions, expecting an attack from an angle, or maybe I am just so completely unprepared for something like this, I'm simply looking for something to do with my body. Connor is steady, but the kind of steady that keeps balanced on a needle over shards of glass. I nod. I remember Connor carries a pocket knife. I asked him to take it out, and he does. We run as fast as we can, and we stumble and drift over roots and rocks. Thin branches tear at our faces. My eyes, my mouth, all my exposed skin is flecked with bits of dirt and tree bark. Connor is not as fast, or maybe he is just more careful. I pause for him, he catches up, and we take a moment to be sure we are making a straight dash to the parking lot. Not so distant twigs crack, methodical and frequent snaps and tiny crunches, the sound of something moving. It was not us. We are stood still, and only a dozen or so yards away, something is moving. The brush is a shading of black smattered over more distant, indistinct black shapes, but is rustling fiercely enough to be visible even in this inkwell. Running resumes, without a word spoken. The possibility of being snatched from behind continues to hammer through my brain. My shoulders and back tingle with the expectation of being gripped and pulled suddenly. Through the trees ahead there's light. This is enough to abandon all caution and speed toward the glow without any care that may be underfoot or hanging in the branches. In this burst, there are no obstacles. We are fired from the tree line into the parking lot as if it was from a cannon. Tom is there. Sitting on a concrete slab, a girl sits next to him. We have seen them kiss before. That feels like it will never matter again. We pace and shiver in the glow of the parking lot. The drone of the bulbs above us feels like a guardian, as if I had raised the drawbridge and left the hordes outside the gates. It felt like such a fragile comfort, and perhaps nonsensical, all mental. What we saw. Would it care about the light? Would it just burst from the trees and do what I expected it to do? I don't know. This is one of the most unexplainable things I've ever experienced in my life. I took Tom away from his slim, brown-haired companion in lowrider jeans. I told him in the safety of the front lot what we had seen. He did not believe me. He mocked me. He said he got bored of trying to scare us and came back to the rink 5 minutes after we entered the woods. I had no retort. I was not clever or aggressive. I just wanted to get in my mom's SUV and get away from this place. Connor rode home with me. We attempted small talk with my mom, and she mistook 14-year-old shell shock for being exhausted by a long night of roller skating. As we pulled out, I looked one more time at the strange home behind the rink. The iron bars over the windows and the shutters over the doors. Nearly 17 years later, the rink has long since burnt down in a fire. The fire took everything, and only a flat lot now remains. For all of my teenage years, I couldn't have stayed out of the woods, even if you paid me. This encounter was not the only one I would have in the woods of Connecticut. In my early 30s, the world has gotten much smaller, and the horizon seems closer and more mundane every day. Maybe we have chased the specters away as we stripped every mystery to the bone. Maybe older eyes just do not see what younger eyes can. Maybe we cluster around little boxes of light for a reason, and the isolation of the dark remains as hungry as it ever was. A few months back, one of my friends had opened up to me about a creature he said he encountered 2 times around New Jersey, where my mother lives. This same friend and I have encountered a skinwalker in the past while being in New Jersey, and he told me when he was just a boy, he saw something in the fields next to his house out in the middle of nowhere. Whatever he saw still terrifies him to this day. He has had 2 encounters with this so-called creature, one in the middle of the day when he was a boy, and one while waking up in the middle of the night. Here are his encounters with an alleged dogman. These stories are also from his perspective, so I could capture the narrative. I hope you enjoy his stories. Hi, my name is Todd, and I have lived in New Jersey all of my life. Since I was a kid, I had all sorts of paranormal and creature experiences, which I can also tell here in the future at some point. I am a heavy believer in the supernatural, and in dogman and other cryptids, just like my friend Sam. Here are 2 of my encounters with what I believe are dogman. It was a clear sunny day as I was walking alongside a trail that was close to my house. I was only around 7 or 8 years old at the time. It was so beautiful out that day, and as a young kid, I was taking it all in. I was having an absolute adventure, picturing myself just running through the open fields waiting for my mom and dad to get home. The trail I was on has beautiful scenery all around, with tall grass for miles. To my left, there was a dense forest to my right. I just was walking through the woods, as whenever my parents were not home, I would just explore. I was enjoying the walk, taking in all the feels of the nature. The smell of the wood was intoxicating, as well as the chirping birds. Then the woods fell silent. I felt like someone or something was watching me, and my eyes darted around the entire area. I then looked to my left and noticed something in the tall grass. To me, it looked like a big dog, but then I saw that it was crouched down like a man would be if it were hiding. He was covered in brown fur. It looked like it had a muzzle and ears like a German shepherd, and had eyes that were blood red. I thought it was more curious than frightening at the moment, but I was still on edge. I was scared for a bit, but I acted like I did not notice it and just went along my day and ran back to my house. I never really spoke about this encounter with anyone of my family, as they would probably think that I was crazy, but that was my first encounter with what I think was a dogman. The second encounter only happened about 4 or 5 years ago if my memory serves me correctly. At this point in time, I lived in a different house. The house was close to a large forest, and the biggest predators I have seen around here were either coyotes or foxes. Now, what I saw that night was no coyote. I woke up in the middle of the night with my throat dry and realized I was thirsty. I went to the kitchen to get some water when I felt the sudden sense of dread and felt like I was being watched. I investigated the window close to where I was, and to my shock and horror, I saw this huge animal in my backyard. Whatever it was had noticed me, and it was staring at me with these crimson red eyes. I felt utterly terrified, and to my horror, I saw the animal bare its teeth at me and stand up on 2 legs. This creature then started growling, and I could hear it as my window was open slightly. I also saw its breath come out of its mouth, and I realized this thing was a real animal. It looked to be about 7 or 8 feet tall on both legs, with the head of a German shepherd and a body shaped just like a bodybuilder. Whatever this thing was then looked at my fence in my yard, ran to it, and jumped across it into the woods below. I went back to my bed, terrified and could not sleep for the rest of that night. These 2 encounters with these beings have shook me to the core and made me realize that there are creatures that science refuses to recognize out there. Be safe, be careful, and be sure to never explore the woods without being armed in some manner. Although what I'm about to tell you may sound like one of your run-of-the-mill horror movies, I swear the validity of it and what I saw. It all started on an extremely hot July day this past year. My car is almost 20 years old and sometimes overheats on hot days, just like this one. However, until I get a better paying job, it is the car I'm stuck with. This day I was driving through the back roads looking for a family of dog breeders a friend had told me about. I had been searching for the place for several hours and was approaching the warmest part of the day. As per usual, my car began overheating and I was forced to pull over. I picked up my phone to call my girlfriend only to see that my battery was dead. After I spent a couple of minutes cussing my luck, I acknowledged that I was going to have to find someone with a working phone. That was not going to be very easy, unfortunately, as I was out in the middle of nowhere. And, unfortunately, that was also not going to happen unless I started walking. Soon, I spotted an old farmhouse off in the distance and headed toward it. A trip that would have taken a half an hour on a normal day took almost an hour because of the oppressive heat. I had to take several breaks during the journey, but eventually made it. The area around the house looked more like a junkyard, parts of old cars spread about, and I had to weave through a maze of them to try to reach the front door. I knocked on the door for several minutes but got no answer. Thinking maybe that the homeowner may be hard of hearing, I walked around and investigated the windows, hoping to see someone inside. At the side of the house, I spotted a telephone hanging on the wall just inside the kitchen. Now that I knew there was a phone there, I became excited and started calling out for someone. Even after walking all the way around, no reply came. I was about to give up until I saw a woman laying on a bed. I nearly banged on the window to try to get her attention, but I figured that may scare her, so I went back to the front door and let myself in. In hindsight, that was just as scary. Before I entered, however, I took a piece of paper from a notebook I carry with me and wrote out a note explaining what I was doing there. Even then, I called out several times as I approached the bedroom. Still no answer. I continued toward the room. The closer I got to the woman, the more her appearance began to unnerve me. She was lying flat on her back and staring blankly at the ceiling. I had initially believed she was watching the television that was turned on in the room with her, but her eyes sat completely still. Regardless, I got closer, and once I was within a few steps, I handed her the note. When the note touched her hand, she did not react. This caused me to get closer, and this is when I realized something was very wrong. Her face had a very dry, almost mummified look to it. Her hair was a vibrant black, a color not often seen on older females. She had to have known I was there by that point, but her eyes stayed fixated. This is what caused me to lean in even closer and look into her eyes. Rather than being slightly bloodshot or moist looking like most people's, they had a shiny, glassy appearance, like they were fake. Despite this, not until I touched her did I know for sure that she was dead. I realized that perhaps she was a mannequin rather than a human, so I reached down and touched her bare hand. The texture of her skin was dry, but stone cold to the touch. The oddity of this just beginning to really sink in when a loud creaking noise came from behind me. Without a second thought, I tore out of there and ran back down the road in the direction of my car. Within a half a mile, I ran into an older man in a truck, and he agreed to give me a ride into town. I said nothing about my experience to him, and any time he attempted to make small talk, I said as absolutely little as I could. He let me borrow his phone to call my girlfriend, and she agreed to meet us at a gas station on the edge of town. When he let me out there, I thanked him and he went on his way. Once I was safely inside my girlfriend's car, I borrowed her phone and called the police. I had not even told her about it yet, so the look of shock on her face as I described what I saw showed me what my expression likely was at the time when I discovered it. The cops said they would send a car out to the house to check out my claims. I called a wrecker next to pick up my car. The police never called me back, so after waiting 3 days I called to inquire about what they found. It took a few moments to find a person aware of my call, but once I did, the officer said that he and his partner searched the entire property and found nothing out of the ordinary, especially not a mummified woman. I thanked them and hung up. What happened after I fled, I can only guess. The noise behind me was probably the owner of the home, and he hid the woman's body, knowing that the cops were likely to be called. To tell you the truth, I am not sure what I saw in that house on that bed. I am positive that I saw a human laying on the bed, but that is all. More than once I have been tempted to grab a camera and return to that house to get proof of my claims, but fear of the unknown and what else could be waiting for me if I did has stopped me. If the nightmares of her soulless eyes continue, however, I may have no other choice. I was hired to do a catalog shoot for a national company. The shoot was scheduled for August of 2014 in rural Montana. When the time came, I flew in and was driven to a quaint lodge in the mountains in which the shoot was based out of. I was introduced to the lady running the shoot from the company's side. We had worked together once or twice in the past, and I was happy to be working with her again. Her and I were soon joined by her assistant. The three of us spoke for a short time before I was shown to my accommodations. I arrived late in the day, so after eating a small dinner, I turned in for the day. The next morning, everyone involved with the shoot, maybe 12 people in total, met in a large hall for breakfast. Upon the completion of our meal, myself, the lady running the shoot, and her assistant got into a Jeep and went in search of shooting locations. The models and a couple of other people I do not remember followed us in another Jeep. After an hour or more of driving, I spotted a beautiful rocky outcropping, and we set things up. The lighting was fantastic that day. So extraordinary little extra work was needed to get the shots I was looking for. A few hours later, I was done with the location, and it was time for lunch anyway. The Jeep with the models returned to the lodge. However, my counterpart convinced me to check out a breathtaking area she had seen on a walk the day before. She said that she had arrived early in the morning and decided to take a walk before my plane landed. This sounded fine to me, and she insisted it was not that far away. We would be back for lunch soon after the others, no problem. After a 5-minute drive, we made it to the location. She led us about 100 yards down the trail, and it ended on a sheer ledge. No doubt it was a gorgeous spot, but I could see without the right light, the photos would not be able to do it justice. I mentioned this, and she walked closer to the edge to get a better look. She went out much further than I would have recommended. However, I guess she was a bit more occupied with her work than her safety. After taking one too many steps, the loose rock of the cliff broke free, causing her to tumble down the sheer cliff. Her assistant, this cute and kind little girl, rushed over, and if I had not stopped her, possibly would have followed her employer down the hill. Instead, I had her get a strong hold on me, and I slowly and carefully scooted toward the remaining ledge. I took in a big breath and let it out, then looked over to see the poor woman curled up about 75 feet from us. She did not move at first, and I feared for the worst. However, the longer I stared at her, I could begin to see her body make small, almost indistinguishable movements. I let her assistant know this and asked if she could drive. She said yes. I told her to run back to the Jeep and get help. Quicker than lightning, she ran down the trail, and a moment later, I could see the Jeep flying down the road in the direction of the lodge. Even if she was unable to respond, I wanted her to know help was on the way. I yelled down to her and could only hope she could hear what I was saying. Minutes seemed to drag on, but within half an hour, a rescue team arrived to help. The two men lowered down with a special stretcher. They attached her to it. Once she was raised back up to the top, it was clear she was severely injured, but still alive. An ambulance took her away, and all that was left was the waiting. The shoot was obviously on hold until a decision was made on how to proceed. It was ultimately decided to cancel, at least for the foreseeable future, and that was the end of my part in that awful mess. I received no news for a few months, but then I got a call from her. The last 9 weeks had been a near nightmare for herself and her family. The initial swelling on her brain was so bad, she was put into a coma. This would eventually pass, but the long hours of being stuck in bed almost drove her crazy. The list of broken bones in her body went well into the double digits, and even at the time we were speaking, she was still walking on crutches. Over the years since this incident, her and I have kept contact every so often. At the time of me writing this, she has had 5 surgeries on various bones and parts of her body, and will no doubt have several more before she dies. Despite the awful violence of the fall and the long, agonizing convalescence she has suffered through, she still has not lost her sense of humor. On our last call, just a week ago, she said if she could do it all over again, she might pick a shorter distance to fall from. A true heroine, if I've ever seen one. This had to have happened sometime in the early 2000s. My husband was still spending most of his time on the road working for one of the major insurance companies. As a result of this, myself and our young daughter spent most of our days alone. A few years prior, we had purchased a new home on a somewhat isolated piece of land, and the journey between town and home could often be harrowing, especially at the times of heavy rain. Most of the last 5 miles of road that led to the house was nothing more than loose gravel, and not very wide for that matter. My daughter and I found we were stuck on this section of the road on a bad night. I did all that I could to keep our Subaru on the road, but the rain made visibility almost impossible. It was not long until I misjudged one curve and ended up in a ditch. Fortunately, my husband had the foresight to sign us up for one of those roadside assistance programs. I contacted them and was told that the weather was keeping them busy, but they would get to me as soon as they could. Not knowing how long we would be stuck there, I made my daughter as comfortable as I could and waited. The rain stopped soon after, and I was now able to see how far away from home we were. I estimated we were probably about 2.5 miles from the house, and considered walking, until I remembered no one was home to retrieve the car later. Help was on its way, so I guess I could wait. Within 10 minutes of the incident, I could see the headlights of a truck coming toward us and began to get excited. However, it did not turn out to be a tow truck. Instead, it was an older man driving a rusty pickup truck. When he saw the car, he slowed down and investigated as he passed. I thought he was about to offer to pull us out, but he continued down the road. I honestly did not think too much of it at the time, but 5 minutes later, the rusty truck approached us coming from the other direction at a terribly slow speed. He stared at me, once again as he passed, even making eye contact with me briefly, but never did he stop. Things were beginning to look odd, to say the least, but I thought maybe he was just lost and turning around to return to the highway. He was not in any way obligated to help me, of course. Perhaps he thought I was just parked instead of stuck. He probably was not from around there and was just trying to get home like I was. Things did not start to get scary until I noticed the same truck coming toward me for a 3rd time. It had gotten completely dark by this point, and most women I know feel much less safe once the sun goes down. This situation made things look even more sketchy. He did his usual by now slow drive-by. What was different this time was that he stopped the truck after he passed and did a quick 3-point turn in the road. He was now facing us again, stopped about 10 yards away. Rather than get out and come over to offer aid, he sat in the cab and watched us for a few minutes. Only now did he open the door and begin to get out of the truck. Almost as soon as his foot hit the pavement, a pair of headlights appeared from the other direction. The man stayed where he was. He was just watching and waiting for a few minutes before it was close enough to see it was a wrecker. Once he saw this, he jumped back into his truck and made a U-turn and sped away from us. My heart was stuck in my throat as I watched this play out, and not until I could read the name of the company on the side of the tow truck could I begin to relax. The tow truck driver did not hesitate to pull his truck up in front of us and hook up my car. I was finally confident that he was there to help. I got out to thank him. He had us out of the ditch in a few minutes, and we were on our way. For the remainder of the journey, I kept my eyes open for the rusty truck, and even as I drove up our drive, I feared I would see him, waiting for me somewhere. He was not, happily, and I got my daughter into the house for the night. When my husband returned from his latest trip, I told him about what had happened during the last storm, but I left out the part with the strange truck. I knew it would only make him more stressed when he was away, and at that time, he had no other choice but continue his trips. Because of this latest trouble, though, he went out and purchased an almost brand new Jeep with a 4x4 transmission for me. I was over the moon to get it, and I never got stuck again, even when the muddy parts of our property got really bad. It did not take long for the stranger and the rusty truck to pass from my mind. However, for the next 2 weeks, I caught myself looking for it any time I was on that stretch of road. I had almost completely forgotten about the incident until just recently, when I saw a truck like that at the store. It was of course not the same one, but it caused it all to come flooding back, and motivated me to send this into your show. Fortunately, in the preceding years since then, the county has paved and widened the roads, and my wonderful husband gets to come home to us every night. I started my career working in sawmills back in 2007. I was hired for a portable sawmill in southwest Washington state. This mill was located quite literally in the middle of a forest. It was constructed in the early 1970s, and even in the short 30 years of its life, it seemed to have a decent amount of history inside of it. I worked the weekend graveyard shift, 2:30 p.m. to 4:30 a.m. the following day, on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. I was a trim drop operator. I had a partner who I was with. We were the only two who worked in this area. His name is Pete. We would take turns rotating through the night. One of us would run the drop, where you would drop out bad boards, chunks of garbage, and just anything else that could not be made into quality lumber. The boards that would be left to be processed would enter a lugged, chained system, and then be pulled through a scanner, and then a trim box that would cut the lumber to length, and then take them to the next area, which was the sorter. The other of us would sit at an operator's console about 20 feet away and watch monitors that displayed various parts of the machine and process flow. We rotate every few thousand boards to keep from being fatigued. One night, I was running the drop, and Pete was kicked back at the console station reading away at the newspaper. Everything was just going normal as ever, when I glanced over and noticed him peering up at the monitor for the outfeed with a puzzled look on his face. He jumped up and went walking down to the trimmer saw box and looked around it. He also looked at the outfeed. He then walked back, looking quite concerned, sat down, shrugged, and started reading again. This happened a second time, and by now it had my attention. I threw up the skids to stop the flow of lumber and walked over to him and asked him what was up. There was a guy standing at the outfeed. I went down there to see what the hell was going on, and when I got there, he was gone, he said, with a confused look on his face. This did not make sense, because this was an area that was not accessible unless you stopped the machine and activate a catwalk that unfolded from the outfeed of the saw to allow access to a small platform on the opposite side of the machine as we operate it from. I asked him to point out where the guy was hanging. Pete pointed to the platform, slightly frustrated. I shook my head at him and laughed, before running back to the drop to continue running lumber. Pete stayed fixed on the monitors now, newspaper folded up and thrown to the side. No more than 5 minutes go by before he jumps up and runs down to the saw box and outfeed again. This time, I threw the skids up and followed him. By the time we got there, there was nothing. He pointed across the lumber table, which was 30 feet wide, to the platform across the machine and yells, "Who's over there? You aren't allowed to be over here, god dang it!" Both of us waited to see a man who had been on the monitor, but once again, there was nothing there. After a minute or two of looking, we decided to move back to our stations. I walked by the console station, glancing at the monitor, seeing nothing, and Pete followed shortly behind. By the time I made it to the drop to start running again, Pete howled. I snapped over and saw him stabbing the monitor with his finger. He yelled at me to come look. I ran over and investigated the monitor. Sure enough, there was a guy. He was standing on the small platform Pete had pointed out. The monitor is small, grainy, and black and white, but we can work out that this guy is wearing a tin hard hat, a very dirty and worn button-up long sleeve with the sleeves either rolled up or ripped off, and a very thick denim jeans of a dark color. He is just standing there, with his elbows on the handrail looking at the lumber from the saw box. "Wait here," Pete yelled as he stealthily snuck down to the outfeed. As he closed in on the outfeed area, to catch this guy red-handed for being in an area you cannot or should not be able to access while in operation, I looked back and forth at Pete in the monitor. About the time Pete made it to the saw box, the man on the monitor looked up into the camera and literally just faded away. I completely lost my cool. I felt a cold chill run down my back, accompanied by all the hairs on my arms standing up. I sprinted as quickly as I could to Pete, exclaiming, "That ain't a guy. It's no guy." Pete just stood there dumbfounded. Both of us knew that we were looking at an empty platform, and we had no idea what we should do. We were quite disturbed now. Pete crossed his arms in thought before deciding we should call our foreman down to tell him this story. We walked back to the operator's station and Pete grabbed the mic of the radio and called for the foreman. We ran operations until he arrived, both of us ready to bolt for the sawbox in case we saw the entity again. The foreman showed up about 5 minutes or so later, and we stopped running and explained what had happened. The foreman did not look impressed, but he was smiling. He explained that we had probably just seen one of the old-timers. Back in the late 70s, we had a man who worked here who ran the chip bin station, and one day, arrogance got the best of him. Long story short, he got buried in a chip pile and was crushed and suffocated before he could get dug out. As homage to his previous career as a logger in the woods, people think that his ghost roams these halls. Other operators have had occurrences where they have witnessed this entity wandering around different machines, seemingly just watching the flow of lumber. Hi Swamp, my name is Seth. I have recently moved into Virginia City, Montana, about a month ago. I live alone in this 2-story house. Nothing but mountains, small rock formations, and canyons on my property. It is a lot for one person, I know. This city has a high number of UFO activity. Even I have already seen a few UFOs as I sit on my back porch having a beer. I rarely ever get drunk. As a matter of fact, I have not gotten drunk for about 3 months. I only somewhat believe in alien life forms, but I have doubts that they have ever visited Earth. I do not really want to get into that debate, but I have a different opinion on that subject. Anyways, on to the story. It was 3 nights ago, and I was getting ready to go to sleep. I had finished brushing my teeth and went into the kitchen to get a drink from the gallon jug of water in my fridge. Something startled me. I heard this noise from outside the door. As I said, I live in the middle of some mountains, so nobody should be out here. It sounded like a scratch on the wooden door. I stood there for a second, scared of that sound. I had basically frozen solid with my eyes wide open. Whatever was scratching my door did not sound friendly at all. I did not know what to think about it. To be honest, I wanted to leave it and not mess with it. The scratching came from just a couple of feet below my height. I'm 6'3", by the way. The scratching got a little louder, which made it seem overly aggressive. I did not want to take any chances and try to scare it away. So I stood there and waited in hopes that it would just stop and walk away on its own. This thing, or person, really wanted to come in. After about 20 minutes, still standing in the same spot, it finally stopped. I felt that it was no longer there, so finally, I approached my door and opened it slowly. After I realized it was opened, I realized the patio glass door was still closed and locked. The thing is, the scratching sound was bearing against the wooden door, not the patio door. So I thought to myself, what the heck is going on here? There was no way a scratch could happen on the wooden door, knowing the other door was closed and locked. Moments later, I see a bright light heading into the sky upwards, not down like a shooting star would do. I was still only just getting over a bit of an illness, but I was completely sober at the time, so I know I was not hallucinating or imagining this. I am never one who happens to be around when strange things happen, let alone anything exciting. What do you guys think this was? Was this a paranormal being that can do whatever it wants without being detected? Or am I simply crazy? I do not know if this thing was extraterrestrial, paranormal, or perhaps both. I have only heard about people getting abducted while they were asleep, and yes, I have seen the movie The Fourth Kind, which was based on a true story apparently. Hopefully, I will never experience something like this again. Hopefully, I can get your guys' opinions in the comments. To begin this story, I need you guys to know that after the age of 7 and until I was around 13, I would have 2 birthday parties every year. Holidays were doubled for me since my parents were divorced and had joint custody. There was this park on a mountain where I had all of my birthdays with my dad's side of the family. The park itself had a moderately sized wooden playground and some picnic shelters and a bathroom. The best thing about this place was that it was only partially up the mountain, and there was a trail that went up the rest of the mountain. The trail stopped at the very top, at a little viewing platform that overlooked the road beneath the mountain. My cousins had never been allowed to go that far without someone with us. One day, we got to go up alone. Patrick was the one who suggested we follow the rest of the trail, which led into the woods, up the mountain. We were never allowed to go there, so being the rebellious preteens we were, we decided to go into the woods. The first encounter was easily explained. We just found 6 mounds of fresh dirt. Already being nervous, we were convinced people had been buried up there. The mounds were all exactly beside each other, the exact same size and shape. Patrick did climb on one of them. Anyway, we continued the trail. It was beginning to thin out when we found a clearing. The clearing was empty until a man walked into it. This is what scared us. This guy was tall, and that was all we could really tell. His outfit is what scared us. He was wearing a black robe with a hood that covered his entire head. We were freaked out, but did not move as the guy standing in the middle of the clearing was almost like statue still. He was facing away from us and staring up into the sky. Eventually, 2 more people dressed the exact same as him came into the clearing. Patrick wanted to go and say something and even stood up for a second, but something stopped him and made him go pale with his terrified expression. The other 2 figures stood in the exact same way as the first. It's just my luck that I happen to have terrible allergies and suddenly sneezed. All 3 of them snapped their heads to face us in a literal synchronization. We booked it the heck out of there. Halfway down the mountain, we decided that the threat of being in trouble would be worse than anything and decided not to tell our adults. We were relatively young, okay? I know, it's a dumb idea. We should have told somebody. But that look on Patrick's face after he stood up has always stuck with me. So I asked him why he looked so scared. What he said terrified me back then, and it still makes me a bit nervous now. Patrick told me that the second person that entered had a big knife in his hand, and it had some sort of red stain on it. I don't know what was happening up there. I don't know what we witnessed. But I don't think I ever want to explore that mountain path ever again. I do not remember exactly how old I was at the time. Maybe 14 or 15 years old. I had this crazy guy that lived on my street. Everyone called him Crazy Mike. He really was as crazy as you'd imagine, but more on him in a minute. I had this one friend that was a little wild. Let us call him Charlie. He was kind of the adventurous friend that got me to do some crazy stuff. We went through a phase for about 2 or 3 months where we would hang out a lot, and it was honestly a lot of fun. One of the things we would do is explore the nearby woods. There was a lot of wildlife, and anyone can go out there and explore as far as they wanted. We lived on a rather tall mountain, and we would hike up the mountain when we had enough time for the day. We would hike back down and normally get back before dark. We normally took the regular roads back down because it was just a little bit easier to get home that way. My friend lived up a few roads from mine, so I would walk to his house with him and then go home by myself. I remember this one day, we had gone hiking through the creek. Bear in mind, it was freezing outside at the time, typical winter mountain. There was snow on the ground and a lot of water was frozen. At one point, we had the bright idea of walking on the ice. As you might imagine, we fell into the water. It was not very deep or anything, not even enough to go above our chest, but we were dripping with water and it was about 5 degrees outside, and there was snow on the ground. But being the crazy kids we were, it just did not stop us. We continued hiking even after we got soaking wet. I do not know if we had just high tolerance to the cold or if it was adrenaline. We were all good though. We continued for a couple of hours that day, but after a certain point, I finally talked him into heading home for the day. He agreed, and we went out and got on the road. We made our way back down like usual, but this is the point when I started freezing. I was too cold, and I knew my body was not going to make it back down. I knew that I was in danger, like getting near hypothermia or something. When we got to my friend's house, he was more than willing to let me come in and warm up for a few minutes. But just as we were getting to his house, my mom called me. She was angry with me because I had not answered my phone in probably more than an hour or so. I tried explaining the situation to her, but she just screamed at me repeatedly to come home. So I walked the rest of the way home, and that was that. This is where Crazy Mike comes in, because he lives one road above me, and it saves me about 10 minutes of walking if I cut through a part of his property to get to my house. He had a big fence, but so did his neighbor. There was a small walkway kind of area between the two spots. I was obviously in a rush to get home and warm up. In fact, I was jogging most of the way. I had not heard anything from Crazy Mike by that point, so I figured it would be okay if I cut through his property this one time. I started going through, and that was when he came out of his house with an assault rifle. He pointed it at me and started screaming at me like a maniac. Of course, I turned around and sprinted away. I ran all the way back home and told my mom. She honestly thought I was exaggerating and that I should not be cutting through people's property anyway. That was when I started asking people around the area about him. I heard some stories about Crazy Mike and some of the things that he would do. I heard that he was a conspiracy theorist, a drug dealer, a criminal, a felon, and a bunch of other stuff. If I had to sum it up all in one single phrase, a bad guy. Whoever I asked never had anything good to say about him, and the part that freaked me out was that I still had to pass Crazy Mike's house on my way home every single day. I did not have to cut through his property, but I did still have to walk in front of his house on the road to get to mine, and that made me uncomfortable, because now I was constantly worried that I was going to get shot or something. I still would go hiking with Charlie and all that up and through the mountains, but there was no incident for a while, so I thought that was going to be the end of it. However, I noticed something else. He had video cameras on the outside of his property, looking out onto the road. I had never noticed them before, but now that I was aware of his insanity, I paid a little bit more attention. Whenever I walked by, the cameras would follow me. What freaks me out the most was that they were manually operated cameras. They were not the kind of cameras that just follow motion around. He was sitting there operating those cameras every single time I ever walked by, watching me. I'm not sure if he was recording all the footage or not, but he had made me uncomfortable either way. I remember there was one time when I was walking home from Charlie's house at night. It must have been around 10 or 11. It was rather late, and even then the cameras followed me as I walked by. I thought that was going to be it, that nothing was ever going to happen again between me and Crazy Mike. Well, I was dead wrong. It was still during the same winter season, and I was walking home during a blizzard. I know, that's just the kind of guy I was. My mom was going to order pizza that night, and I did not want to miss it. I passed by Crazy Mike's like I always did, and that was when something unexpected happened. He had a giant fence and it had to have been 15 feet tall, and it was thick wood. Part of it was open, and a dog ran after me. I could not tell what kind of dog it was, but it was angry and barking at me loud. It ran after me, and I could tell that it was going to bite me as hard as it could. I got a seriously violent vibe from that dog. I was lucky that I was in really good shape and managed to sprint away. I did not slip or anything else either. That situation could have turned bad fast. Anyway, my family ended up moving a few weeks later for unrelated reasons. My mom got a new job in a different state, so that was the end of my experience with Crazy Mike. And even now, I wonder what his problem was. Was he really a drug dealer or a criminal? Why was he so paranoid about having some kid walk in front of his house or cutting through a piece of his property? I've asked my friends on Facebook a couple of times if they have heard anything about Crazy Mike, and apparently nothing has changed. So, make of that what you will. I guess the moral of the story is there are some crazy mountain people out there, so be safe. Sometimes, walking in front of their house is enough to set them off. Rory and I were halfway up Cross Kalur, a huge snow chute on the eastern side of Colorado's Mountain of the Holy Cross, when the snowstorm rolled in almost a whole day early. That is when we knew we were in some serious trouble. A few days prior, the TV weathercast had told a completely different story. It reported a clear weather window well within our Thanksgiving break, which was one of our only opportunities to tick off Mountain of the Holy Cross from our climbing bucket list. We had already bagged several of Colorado's mountains that winter, and we had been eyeing Holy Cross's steep, snow-filled Kalur for the previous year. Our plan was to stash some overnight gear at a base camp only a few miles from the start of our climb. From there, we would go for the snowshoot, and then hike out once it was night. We had planned to start the climb in the afternoon when the snow was just about soft enough to provide our boots with grip. We arrived at the base of the snowshoot around noon. About 300 feet up, the snow was way deeper than expected, but the sky was a clear blue. We were on schedule, and the climb did not seem like it was going to be too taxing. Additionally, we knew we would have cell service on the top of the peak. We did not expect to need it, but we were considering it for our safety. We were right about the cell service, but wrong about the 2-hour climb. The higher we went, the deeper the snow became. Soon it was loose and powder. All the way to the rock bed beneath, we were moving more slowly than expected, but if the weather held, we would still make it up before dark. A few hours into the climb, slogging upward within the steep Kalur walls, we did not even notice that the dark clouds were moving in from the west. The first snows came about halfway through the afternoon. By 5:30 it was pounding down, with the wind drowning out our attempts to communicate. If there were ever a time to quit, that was it. But behind us the snow was kicked out and slick from our climbing, way too unstable for any kind of descent. So we went with our only viable option, pushing on toward the summit, and descending the much easier north ridge as quickly as we could manage. We tried to focus on keeping calm, pushing onward as darkness fell around us. The blizzard rushed through our headlamp beams and pelted our face with ice. When I looked down at Rory, the terrified look in his eyes perfectly matched how I felt. By the time we finally reached the summit, around 7 that evening, we figured the worst was over. We called our parents and told them everything was fine and we were going to commence the hike down. But when we looked around, we saw only sheer drop-offs and total darkness. There was no way for us to find our descent, which is dangerously easy to miss even in daylight. Plus, the wind up top was blowing something fierce, making it equally hazardous to approach any steep drops. With no choice but to hunker down, we settled under an overhanging lip of rock below the summit to wait out the storm. We had what we were wearing: goose-down jackets, insulated pants, hats, and gloves, plus a little food and water. We prayed that it would be enough for us to survive. But despite our pleas to the Almighty, conditions soon worsened. Strong winds tore through our improvised shelter, and our feet grew agonizingly cold. We took off our boots and socks and put our feet into each other's armpits, massaging our toes to keep the feelings in them. I could not get my mind off thinking about how my parents would react to the news that we had died up here that night. This is when the severity of our situation started to really dawn on me. We had been feeling pretty cocky up until this point. By now, I was truly frightened. Temperatures dropped to negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit with the wind chill that night. I stopped shivering, a sign of hypothermia. But Rory and I stayed positive, and I am convinced that was the only thing that got us through that night. I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember was the sun's warmth washing over us. Thankfully, the storm had passed, but the descent was still hard to find. We saw several ridges, and at the bottom of one, we spotted what looked like East Cross Creek, which we had walked along 2 days before. We rappelled toward it, thinking we were home free. But when we reached the creek, we realized that we had accidentally gone down the south ridge, the opposite direction of our trailhead. The one thing we did not want to do, since at that point we had lost all our cell services. On the summit the night before we worried about surviving, now we were annoyed with ourselves, low on food, and tired as hell. Still, we were confident we would find our way out. Below the tree line we managed to pick up a trail that took us to a spot that we thought we recognized as the east side of the mountain. We were not ready to admit that our delirious minds may have been playing tricks on us. We followed faint trails through the forest, turning here and there as the compass dictated, but we always ended up back where we started. We later found out locals called this area the Bermuda Triangle of the Rockies. Iron deposits in the rocks can throw off magnetic instruments, and our compass was taking us in circles. We knew we should have stayed put to wait for rescue, but we could not. With water-soaked boots, it was either move or lose appendages to frostbite. Our optimism was running dry. I would start to feel a frog in my throat, but in those moments you must either crack a joke or cry, so we messed around, talked about girls, sang old Zeppelin songs, and laughed about whatever we could, any distraction to keep us going. As the sun went down, our second unplanned night out, we gathered up tinder and took out our lighters. But, to our absolute horror, they remained waterlogged with snowmelt. Despite our best efforts to dry them, neither of us could get anything, not even a spark, out of them. By this point, Rory was too weak to continue, so I piled pine branches of snow for us to spoon on top of. We managed to laugh and made a few cuddle jokes, but we were starting to realize that our families did not know if we were alive. That made it tough to keep things light. Soon we both stopped shivering, and neither of us could feel our feet. Matt turned to me. "Dude, we could die out here," he said. "I'm okay with it because I'm still glad to not be on that couch playing video games. But this is much earlier than I thought it would be. I'm not ready." We laid in silence. Rory fell asleep with his head on his right hand, a position that would cut off circulation just enough to give him frostbite in his thumb. Again, temperatures dropped below freezing, and again we woke up in the morning, somehow alive. We had not been hiking long when we saw a helicopter. It was distant, but for us, it took up the whole sky. Numb feet forgotten, we ran into a meadow, and I waved a jacket and a trekking pole with a bright red hat on it. The chopper flew right past us. It circled back 4 more times before flying off. We felt like we had watched our last chance vanish, and that is when I finally broke down. There was nothing to say. Roy just laid his head on my lap, and we both sobbed. An hour later, the helicopter returned. It had only turned back to refuel, and this time, it came straight to us. We could not stop smiling. It was finally over. I was so elated I tried to hug a rescuer, who just threw me into a jump seat and strapped me in. "We were told to look for bodies," he said, as soon as we flew off. I could feel the adrenaline drain out of me. My whole body was in pain. I had been too numb to feel until now, but still I had never felt better. It was honestly one of the lowest, and then highest points of my entire life. So I am not entirely sure if this will make it to the show, but this is an experience that happened to my husband and I while we were exploring the Great Smoky Mountains, more so the Blue Ridge Parkway on the North Carolina side. We are both super into missing 411 and like to creep each other out with stories of skinwalkers. Anyway, We are driving along the Blue Ridge Parkway, stopping at the many different overlooks, and overall, it was gorgeous. We went back just a week ago, early November, and the weather was perfect. We had seen a few side roads, some named and some unnamed. I'm not 100% sure what possessed us to go off-road. We decided to take one of these unnamed roads. The road was gravelly. There was a bridge or tunnel that we had to go through. It was covered in graffiti, so we thought, oh, okay, people come through here, there's graffiti, so clearly we're not the only people who have been down here, and we continued. We came across these 3 open gates to 3 different roads, one to our left, one to our right, and one straight in the middle. The one to the left had a gate that swang outward, as if it were exit, and the other 2 swung inward, like an entrance. So we chose the middle road and continued again. We started on down this road, and suddenly the gravel turned to dirt, and the road went from a decent size to a very slim 1-lane road. If you have ever been in the mountains, you know that the roads can be nerve-wracking. Sharp curves, one side of the car facing the mountain, and the other side clearly showing you a massive drop off the side of said mountain. Imagine all of that on this tiny road. If someone were coming up the road, I would have to back up. There was nowhere to turn. We went down this mountain for a good 20 minutes before we saw, on this dirt road, no bug sounds, no birds, absolutely nothing. There was a small turnoff. I decided to go down it thinking the road connected and took us back up. It probably did, but there was a stream going right over the part where the road was supposed to connect. There was a red truck on the other side of the stream. 2 guys watching us. They crossed over the stream and went past us, looking at us and nodding. I got a glimpse of one of the guys, and something about him felt off. I cannot explain it, but I got a nervous feeling deep in the pit of my stomach. Now, I do not have an off-road car. I have a Tiguan, a mini SUV. I do not even have 4-wheel drive. None of this was a smart idea, I know. I decided I should not go over the stream in case my tires got stuck, and we did not have any cell phone service, so we would not be able to call for help if the car did get stuck, so we decided to turn around. I am a master at 3-point turns. This day, however, my husband had a feeling he should get out and help me turn around. I kept having this nervous feeling and did not want him to get out of the car, but he insisted, and so he did. He helped me turn around with ease and got back in the car, and we went back up the little side road, deciding whether to go back up the mountain to where we came in or keep going down. It was then that he told me he saw something in the stream as we drove down it, and that is why he wanted to get out and see what it was. It was a piece of metal, like sheet metal, like part of a broken guardrail, and it was sticking out of the ground like it was intentionally put there. There were no guardrails anywhere near us. There was no reason for there to be a chunk of metal stuck in the ground. We were surrounded by trees and nature, not a single metal structure anywhere near us that could explain why this was there. He said after that he got an uneasy feeling. He didn't tell me any of this until we were back in our cabin, safe and sound. But for some dumb reason, we continued to keep going down this stupid mountain. We continued down the road for a little bit longer, thinking we were going to reach a bottom point and go back up the mountain and come out through the other gate. No, we reached a house. A single white house. Not abandoned, just sitting there, hidden behind a bunch of trees, and at the near base of this mountain. I looked at my husband, who looked at me, who looked back at this house, and we said, no, we gotta get out of here. We looked at the road ahead of us, and it continued to go down. Like, how much further down can you go from the base of this mountain? I have no idea, because when I saw that steep decline, where the road continued to go further and further down, I noped out. I turned the car around and we started driving back up this mountain. I want to mention that the further we drove this road, the quieter and darker it kept getting. It was 3 p.m. on a super sunny day, and the forest we were surrounded by on this mountainside was not very dense. I could look up and see blue sky clearly, but around us was this feeling of eerie and darkness. It was not a good feeling. Even as we turned and made our way up the mountain again, my husband was worried about other cars coming down, but I looked at the road and noticed our tire tracks were the only ones on this road. I got this immense feeling of being watched. I kept looking in my rear view, thinking I was going to see someone or something. Maybe even that red truck from earlier coming up at us. But there was nothing, and I could not shake the feeling that something was watching us and was not happy that we were around. It was not until we were back at the top of the mountain where the road began we had heard birds again, heard the chirp of insects, and everything lightened back up. The air felt less thick, but our anxiety, that stayed heavy for a couple of days after this. After this happened, we went to our cabin and looked up similar stories. We looked up a map of the area and tried to see if there were any missing people or any weird things that have gone around. Tons of people have gone missing in that area, and we felt so stupid for being so careless. Thankfully, we are safe now, and just thinking about this sends shivers down my spine. Because what if we had kept going? What if I ran over that metal thing and busted my tires? What if the red truck came chasing after us? For anyone interested, or can find more information on what we experienced, we were in between Jenkins Ridge Overlook and Big Witch Gap on the Blue Ridge Parkway. This happened to me about 5 years ago, and at the time, I had a lot of crazy ideas about life and was not afraid to say them. This behavior put me into a conflict with most people, especially those closest to me, like my parents. We would butt heads at least twice a week. It was usually my fault. I was not just a loud idiot, I was also a slob. Do not get me wrong, I bathed religiously and had overall great hygiene. I fell short when it came to picking up. Whenever I bought something, I usually wadded up the receipt and chucked it on the floor. Just sloppy crap like that. I did not realize how fast that stuff added up. Before I knew it, I could hardly even see my floor. And to be honest, I did not really care. Anyway, one day I said something very disrespectful to my folks. My mom slapped me. She had never touched me before, so I was a bit shocked. Instead of apologizing, I called her a stupid B-word. This set my dad off. Some more words were exchanged and he told me to get out. In my deluded brain, I thought this would be no big deal. I would crash in my car until I had enough to get my own place. Then I would never have to deal with their rules again. I had no earthly idea how hard this was going to be. I grabbed my laptop and took my junky 1992 Civic. I worked that night as usual. Afterward, I laid back down in my back seat and tried to go to sleep. The parking lot lights made it hard, but I eventually managed to doze off. Around midnight, a banging woke me up. It was a cop and I told him the situation, but he said I had to move on regardless. I moved on to the next place and the same thing happened. For the rest of the night, I hopped from place to place, being told to move on every time. I got little sleep. Finally, around 6 a.m., I caught a few hours in the Walmart parking lot. Later that day, I went inside the store and bought a few things including a cheap sleeping bag and a blanket. I noticed I was starting to get a tad smelly, so I cleaned up in the bathroom sink. The cracks in my theory were already beginning to show. Even after my, bath and a liberal application of deodorant, I still felt dirty. I took another nap until I had to go to work. I was worried my whole shift someone was going to notice I was wearing the same clothes as the day before. If they did, no one said anything. I headed straight for Walmart afterwards. This time I parked my car away from the lights. I was much more comfortable now and quickly fell asleep. Sometime in the night, a noise outside woke me up. I assumed it was a cop. When I stuck my head up, instead, I saw a person rummaging through my glove box. He must have not seen me laying in the back. I was half asleep and more curious than scared, as I should have been. I sat up and asked him what he was doing. This must have scared him because he jumped up out of the car and peeked down into the back. When he saw me, his eyes got big. He pulled out a knife and began leaning into the car. By now, I was squeezed between the seats. When I saw the knife, I grabbed the door and attempted to shut it. He got his knife-wielding arm in the door and tried to pull it open with another. I was fighting against this, pulling the door with both hands. This seemed to go on forever. I was about to lose my grip when I saw a flash to my left. Suddenly, The guy yanked his arm out and the door slammed shut. I did not realize what was happening until I noticed a second man standing outside and saw the ninth guy running in the distance. The second guy walked up to my passenger side window and asked if I was okay. I assumed it was safe now and stepped out. I thanked him for chasing the man off. He explained he had been gassing up his car and heard the struggle. He turned around and saw the knife flashing through the windshield. The guy must have been spooked and ran when he saw him coming. He asked what caused the fight. I explained it was an attempted robbery. I had scared the guy and he pulled a knife. Then I explained the situation. He turned out to be very sympathetic. He said he had been homeless after a while when he left the army. What he did next, I will forever be grateful for. He offered his driveway to me. We are strangers, obviously. He did not know me from Adam, but he believed every man deserved a place to sleep that was safe. During the day, I was on my own. However, after work, I would be allowed to park at his home. That way, I would not be harassed by cops or worry about being robbed. I thanked him yet again and was almost crying. He introduced himself as Nathaniel. We shook hands and I followed him home. That night, I slept better than I had in, honestly, a long time. I drove around that morning and thought about how terrible my life of freedom had been. I was on the road to enlightenment, but it would take a few more days to reach my destination. I would repeat the same pattern day after day. Wake up and take a shower with Nathaniel's water hose, drive to get breakfast, and hang out at Starbucks for the free internet until work, go to work, and then drive back to Nathaniel's to sleep. Not until the fourth day did I go inside his house, and I never asked before then. Neither of us knew each other, and I did not blame him for his caution toward me. That fourth morning was a Saturday, about 7 a.m. Nathaniel knocked on my window and invited me in to have breakfast with his family. I was a bit nervous to meet them. He introduced me to them one by one. They were all genuinely nice. We made small talk, and when we had finished, his wife said I could take a shower. I almost broke down right there. This woman, that had never met me until this morning, was treating me like a son. She reminded me of my mom. I was beginning to see how much I had taken my family for granted. After my shower, Nathaniel and his wife invited me to sit down and talk. I was scared what they would say. I should not have been. We just talked about my situation and they asked what I had planned moving ahead. I was not sure, honestly. Nathaniel did give me a great piece of advice. He asked if I thought my relationship with my parents was salvageable. I figured it probably still was. He recommended I patch things up with them. He said he had a rocky history with his father. He always intended to reconcile with him, but he died before that could happen. He said he wishes every day that he didn't wait. Even if I decided I did not want to go back home, I should at least tell them I was sorry. I thanked them for the advice and all their hospitality. Later, as I sat at Starbucks, I thought about how I had treated my folks. It was not until that morning that I realized how lucky I truly was. I decided I wanted to go home. Not so much for comfort's sake, but more so for my parents so they would know that I was safe. At least that's what I told myself. That evening I called them, my mother answered, and I made sure to apologize the right way. I told her all that I had learned over the last week, did not mention the knife thing, and did not want to scare her. Then I asked her to speak to my father. I apologized to him also and said most of what I told my mother. Only then did I ask if I could return home. When he said, "Of course you can. You're our son, and we love you," I broke down. I thanked him for being a great father, and I said I was on my way. I know this story might not be the scariest thing you've ever shared, but I thought it was worth sharing. This happened when I was in college, 4 years ago. I went to a university that was very close to an ocean on the East Coast. I made friends with some people on the weekend, and one guy in the group of people I met invited us to go out on his boat with him. He described his boat to a bunch of people, and was very proud to have it. It sounded like an expensive sailboat by the way he described it. I'm not really familiar with boats, and hadn't ever really been on one other than a cruise ship when I was like 11. This guy said his parents bought one for him, and that made sense because he was known to be a spoiled kid. He was nice enough though, and the idea of cruising around some Saturday afternoon and drinking some beers sounded appealing. After that conversation, I saw him around in school, but didn't really talk to him much, until one day he approached me in the library and asked if I still wanted to go sailing. I said sure, that sounded awesome. and he told me the following day he was going out on the water, and it would be a perfect opportunity for me to join him. After a lengthy conversation about how sailing works, and him assuring me it was safe and he had all the proper training, I told him I'd meet him at the docks the next morning. That night, my roommate asked me what I was doing for the weekend, and I told him that I made plans to go out sailing. He freaked out on me and told me he really wished he could go, and that I was sure that the other guy would be cool with it. The next morning, my roommate and I grabbed some coffee and grabbed some beer to bring along with us on our voyage. We ate some breakfast, and then we headed over to the docks to meet the guy. We were pretty excited, and when we got there, we followed the direction he gave me and found his boat. It was a huge orange and white sailboat. We stood on the dock next to the boat looking at it, when the guy popped his head up from somewhere and immediately showed a look of concern on his face. He jumped off the side of the boat onto the dock next to us. He looked at my roommate and then myself and asked, "Who is this?" I told him he was my roommate. He was cool and that he had asked if he could come along. I told him I didn't think he would mind. The guy looked very annoyed, and it was awkward as hell for a few moments. The guy kept looking back and forth at the boat and then us. He took his hat off and rubbed his head like he was really stressed out. Eventually he sighed and said it was fine. I'll fast forward now to the part of the story that was scary as hell. A few hours later, we were on the boat, drinking and having fun. The water was pretty smooth sailing, and the sun was shining bright on us. The guy acted a bit off the whole time, and I figured it was because I brought my roommate. After drinking 3 or 4 beers, I felt the courage to ask the guy what was wrong, and if he was still pissed I brought my roommate. He responded with something along the lines of, "It just kind of ruined my plans." My roommate chimed in, with a smile on his face, and asked the guy, "What plans?" I could tell my roommate thought it was funny because it sounded like the guy wanted to be alone with me. The guy looked at him and said, "Well, because you're here, I can't kill him." This took me off guard completely, and I felt fear and unbelievable relief hit me at the same time. My roommate and this guy started cracking up, and my roommate brushed it off as a joke. I honestly didn't know what to think. Was this guy serious? Did I avoid being killed by this asshole? Is his sense of humor just that weird? I believe I got my answer when I went below the deck an hour later to grab another beer from the fridge. Next to his fridge was a brown swinging door that led to a small private bedroom quarters. I was feeling the beer pretty good by this point, and without thinking, pushed the door open. Laying on the foot of the bed was a big-ass cinder block, some yellow rope, tape, and what looked like a recorder of some sort. After seeing that, I felt sick to my stomach and wanted off that boat as soon as possible. I wanted to go back up and confront the guy, but decided against it because of what he might have been on, who knows what he was capable of. Could be on some serious drugs or even worse. What seemed like hours and hours more of being with this guy, we finally made it back to the dock. We said our goodbyes, and on the way back to my room, I told my roommate about what I had seen. He couldn't believe it. I'm pretty damn sure that my roommate saved my life that day by wanting to go with me. And I kid you not, I never saw that guy again on campus. What he had planned, I don't know, and I really don't want to think about it. Hey Swamp Folk, sorry to interrupt this upload, but I just wanted to do a quick shout out to today's sponsor, BetterHelp. BetterHelp will assess your needs and match you with your own licensed professional therapist. You can start communicating in under 48 hours time. It's not a crisis line, it's not self-help. It is professional counseling done securely online. There are a broad range of expertise available, which may not be locally available in many areas. The service is available for clients worldwide. You can log into your account anytime and send a message to your counselor. You'll get timely and thoughtful responses. Plus, you can schedule weekly video or phone sessions, so you won't ever have to sit in an uncomfortable waiting room ever again. BetterHelp is committed to facilitating great therapeutic matches, so they make it easy and free to change counselors if needed. It's more affordable than traditional offline counseling, and financial aid is always available. BetterHelp wants you to start living a happier life today. I myself deal with bipolar 2, and having somebody to talk to is very nice. You can visit their website and read their testimonials that are posted daily. Visit betterhelp.com/swamped That's betterhelp.com/swamped. Join the over 1 million people who have taken charge of their mental health with the help of an experienced professional. In fact, so many people have been using BetterHelp recently that they are recruiting additional counselors in all 50 states. This is a special offer for Swamp Dweller viewers only, getting 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/swamped. In the 80s growing up, we didn't have all the distractions that kids have today, so we had to make up our own things to do. Many times, this meant going outside, going hunting, or making up games. For our generation, our parents told us to be outside, but for us that lived in a small town, these activities were in abundance. There was one type of activity that almost everyone took part in, and this was riding some type of ATV or dirt bike. For me, this was one of my biggest pastimes when I was a child. When I was just 7 years old, a man on the highway was selling a YZ80. Now for me, this was an awesome sight. All I could think of was getting on that dirt bike and riding all day around where I lived. But my dad had other ideas. He thought I was much too young to have something so awesome. It took a few weeks of constant badgering for me to convince my dad to buy it for me. But in the end, my perseverance prevailed, and my dad bought it for me. I was so excited and could not contain myself. Now, I did not know how to ride a dirt bike at the time. The first time that I got on the machine, I popped the clutch, did a wheelie, and flipped the bike. Now, this did not inspire any confidence with my father. It took a little time, but I quickly got good at riding this badass machine. Luckily, I was able to use this open field to perfect my skill as a dirt bike rider. As my friends learned that I had a dirt bike, they started taking me around and showing me a few trails around my town. It slowly became one of our pastimes. We would do this almost every single day after school. It was one of my memories as a child that I really hold on to. There was one place that we went riding. This place was called Emmeline's. I never really knew the person or why it was called this, but there was an old, abandoned house way out in the middle of these woods. This old house had been out there for many years. It had a lot of good riding trails around it, from hills to creeks to wide open trails that you could really open your machine on. Most of the time, there were 2 or 3 of us that would go at the same time, but there were times that I would go out on my own. I had done these solo rides several times before this day. On this day, I could not go right after school. I had some homework from school that I could not get done at school, so I had to go home and get it done. I could not ride until everything was done, unfortunately, but I think most people know that. So it was later on in the day that I could take my daily ride. It was about 6 in the afternoon before I took off. Now, this was in the summertime, so it didn't usually get dark until around 8:30 or so. So I knew it would not be a very long ride because my dirt bike did not have any lights on it. I would have a few hours before I had to return home, though. Emmeline's was only about 5 minutes from my house. As I got on my machine, I could not help but put a smile on my face. I absolutely loved this thing. I loved to be on my bike. After fueling up the machine and checking it over, I put it in neutral, kicked the bike, and started it up. Now, a few days before I had broken my clutch cable, so after starting it, I had to give it a push, jump on, and throw it into gear. This was no big deal, I had done it before. I got rather good at it. My dad had to order the cable and it had not come in quite yet. Off I went, as happy as a young boy could be on his dirt bike. I got to the trails and immediately jumped right in. I'd been ripping up the trails for about an hour and not seen anyone else on them. I guess everyone had better things to do on that day. In the middle of the woods was an open field. This field was about 4 or 5 acres big if I had to guess. It had a fence built up around it. The fence had been up for a long time. It was rusted and broken in quite a few places. But for the most part, it was intact and in decent shape. Like I said, I'd been riding hard for about an hour and had felt the call of nature. Since I had not seen anyone around, I decided to just stop on the trail and relieve myself. Now, I must mention that the dirt bike I had was a racing bike, so it did not have a kickstand, unfortunately. So I had to stop and lean it against a fence post. As I was relieving myself, I noticed that it was very, very quiet. Now, I did not think too much about this because I had been riding for about an hour straight. The dirt bike was pretty loud, so I just figured it was because of me. As I was going to the bathroom, I heard some rustling about 50 or 60 yards away from me. I looked that way and I did not see anything at first. So, I assumed that it was probably just a little squirrel, since they were everywhere out here. Finishing my business, I started to feel anxious for some reason. This heavy feeling came over me, like I was being watched. I looked all around me, but once again, I could see nothing. The bike was only a couple of feet away from me, so I started walking toward it. I took one step and heard something start walking behind me. I immediately turned around expecting to see one of my friends trying to sneak up on me. But, to my astonishment, there was absolutely no one there. Trying to shrug the experience off, I walked to my bike. But every step I took, I swear I heard one step behind me. By this time I was so scared, I did not know what I was going to do. Figuring the only thing I could do was run the few feet to my bike, jump on it, and take off. This had to be a seamless action though, since I did not have a clutch to take off with. I had to kickstart the bike, push it, and throw it into gear all in one motion, if I was going to get away from whatever was behind me. Gathering up all the courage and strength I had, I ran. Jumping on the bike, kickstarting it, and shoving it all at the same time was very hard. Somehow, while I was doing all of this, I never stopped hearing the footsteps behind me. I knew whatever it was only a few yards behind me. Once I was on my way, I felt a sudden breeze on my back, like something had made a swipe at me and just missed. This scared me even more and put more energy and urgency into me. As I slammed the bike into gear, I gave the bike all that it had. I was shifting gears and sliding around every corner like I was a professional. I looked back once and I could see the trees moving, but I was never able to see anything. Even though I did not see anything, it did not take away my sense of emergency to get out of those woods. Once I made it back to the road, I stopped, turned the bike off, and tried to gather myself. It took me a few minutes, but as I did I heard it. The most god-awful scream I had ever heard. It started out low, but by the time that it ended, it was so loud that I could feel it in my chest. I got that bike going and got home as fast as I could. It took me a long time before I went back into those woods, but when I did finally go back, it would always be with friends. This was a moment in my life that I will never forget. This happened back in 2010 on Thanksgiving. For reference, I am a male, and I was 20 years old and had transferred to a university in Northern California to pursue a degree in parks and recreation. This was the first time in my young life I had ever been away from my family for the holidays, so it was a bit different. However, it was not all that bad. I had my roommates and some other friends I had met, and we decided on having a potluck at our dorm. Now, what should have been an evening of fun, food, and games would start off with something quite bizarre. You see, before we began dinner, which was being prepared by my roommate Damien and his girlfriend Samantha, I wanted to go for a run around campus. Hands up for those listening who like to work out before huge meals. Anyway, hopefully it is not just me and I'm not some weirdo. Anyways, the sun had just set over the horizon when I put on my running shoes and advised my friends I would be back in about 45 minutes or so. I proceeded to head down the flight of stairs. We were on the 3rd floor of the dorm, by the way, and I began heading north, toward the other side of the campus. Now when I got there, I proceeded to do 2 laps around the entire school. In total, it took me about 30 minutes, a little faster than I expected. The last 10 minutes were a cool down. Now remember, I crossed the street, since our university is in the middle of downtown, and I walked over to a convenience store, I recall my friend Damien asking if I could go and pick up some extra plastic cups and plates. I give him a call, and he asked if I could also bring some napkins. I agreed, and I make the quick purchases. But here's when things would change. When I exit the convenience store, and I am waiting at the streetlight, enjoying the nice quiet evening, I get approached from my left. I looked for just a moment, and it was just a homeless man. I assumed he was going to ask me for money, and I was even prepared to hand him $2 of change I had left over, to spread some positivity and support. But I went cold when the man leaned in my ear and gave me the creepiest voice I'd ever heard. "Give me your wallet and your phone. Don't make any sudden movements." I remember standing there, thinking, was this some sort of joke? But then I saw it. I looked down for a moment, and I could see a sharp object. A knife. My fight or flight response immediately took into effect, but I tried to play it cool. Since he is literally within lunging distance. "Okay, let me grab them. Give me a second." The man lets out a chuckle and tells me not to make any sudden movements again, before backing up ever so slightly, presumably to allow me to reach into my pockets and give him my phone and wallet. This distance, which might have been maybe 4 or 5 inches, was enough of a distance where I felt comfortable in running and trying to get away from him. Just so you know, I have no idea how fast this man is. I have always been a runner myself, but you just never know. In one quick motion, I hurl the bag of cups, napkins, and plates right at his face, and with this distraction, booked it across the street. Mind you, the signal to cross had not come just yet, and there were cars still driving through the intersection. Man, looking back, I always despised how long that thing took. Anyways, I did not get hit, thank goodness. I might have angered some drivers, but hey, at least it beats being mugged. I continued toward the campus and looked back for a moment. I see the homeless man standing at the streetlight with the look of defeat. We had this 5-second stare down before finally he put his hands in his pockets and turned to walk in the other direction. I felt a sigh of relief come over me, but I was not safe yet. I booked it all the way back to the dorm, which required a fob key to enter the building, and it's not until I was in the lobby that I could finally catch my breath. A couple of students who had just gotten off the elevator saw me and asked what was wrong, and why I looked pale as a ghost. I told them what happened, and they agreed I had experienced something profoundly disturbing. Eventually, I caught my breath, and I called the campus police so that I could provide them with details of what had just occurred. They told me they would get into contact with the police department, but I never found out if they ever caught the guy or not. By the way, the entire campus sent out a text message telling students to remain in lockdown, but it was lifted half an hour later. I am still not sure if they ever caught the guy or not. I surely didn't see him again, and there doesn't seem to be any more reports of people being mugged. As for the paper plates, cups, and napkins, we ended up getting some from our neighbors. The rest of the evening went by as normal, albeit with quite a scare.
First off, sorry for my bad English. This story is 100% real. Here is a little bit about me. I live with my mom, dad, and younger brother. We also have a dog, and we live in the very rural area of Bavaria, Germany. When this happened, I was about 13 years old. We do not have any close neighbors around us. It was a very cold Saturday in December. I remember the day because my mother only worked on Saturdays. My brother, father, and I spent our afternoon watching movies. In fact, we watched one of the Narnia movies. It was close to 5 p.m. at this point. Since it was winter, it was nearly getting dark outside. The room was only lit by the TV and our fireplace. At one point, my brother looked outside the window because it started to snow heavily. We all looked outside the window and suddenly, my dog began to growl aggressively. He ran up and down the room very alerted. This was incredibly unusual for him to do so. My dad stood up and looked around, but he did not see anything. After a few minutes, he began to calm down again. We returned to our movie, and everything was fine for a few more minutes. Then he started doing it again. I noticed my brother was staring out the window next to our back door. I asked him what he saw, and he just shook his head. Then suddenly, we saw an old lady approaching our back door. We were baffled because hardly anyone comes out here, especially not an old lady like her. She looked to be around 80 to 90 years old, wearing one of those typical grandma aprons and a headscarf. Mind you, it was about -10 degrees Celsius outside. She tapped on the back door glass and started to smile very weird. Meanwhile, my dog hid under the table whimpering and growling. My brother came close to me, and my dad walked to the back door and opened it a bit. In a confused tone, he asked what she was doing in our backyard. She smiled and looked directly at us, not even noticing my dad. She took a step forward to the door, shoving her foot into the crack of the door. My dad immediately shut the door close. She glared at him, and then at us before she started to laugh maniacally. Then she just calmly walked away like nothing had happened. We looked at each other in absolute confusion, not knowing what to do or what to say. My brother and I looked outside the window behind us, but we could not see her. The only way in or out of our backyard was this small path next to the house. From the window behind us, we must have seen her leaving, but she never passed by the window. My dad stepped outside and could not see her anywhere. Neither could he see any footprints in the snow. There was absolutely no way the tracks could have been covered by the snow that quick. To this day, we do not know what we have encountered that day. And I don't know if this was anything paranormal or just some crazy old lady. It may not seem creepy to you, but to us kids, this was the most terrifying thing we had ever witnessed.